Part 5. The Ritual of Chud. It is not to be done. The sea pidge has rotted out the serpent. The mesh is decayed. Loosen the flesh from the machine. Build no more bridges. For what air will you? Fly to Spain, the continents? Let the words fall anyway, at all, that they may hit. Love, Aslan. It will be a rare ventations. They want to rescue too much. The flood has done its work. By William Carlos Williams. Patterson. Look and remember. Look upon this land, far, far across the factories and the grass. Surely they will let you pass. Speak then, and ask the forest and the loam. What do you hear? What does the land command? The earth is taken. This is not your home. Carl Sparlow. Travelodge for Exiles. Chapter 19. In the Watches of the Night. 1. The Derry Public Library. 1:15 a.m. When Ben Hanscom finished the story of the Silver Slugs, they wanted to talk, but Mike told them he wanted them all to get some sleep. You've had enough for now, he said, but Mike was the one who looked as if he had had enough. His face was tired and drawn, and Beverly thought he looked physically ill. But we're not done, Eddie said. What about the rest of it? I still don't remember. Mike's right, Bill said. Either we'll remember or we won't. I think we will. We remember all that we need to. Maybe all that's good for us, Richie suggested. Mike nodded. We'll meet tomorrow. Then he glanced at the clock. Later today, I mean? Here, Beverly asked. Mike shook his head slowly. I suggest we meet on Kensington Street, where Bill used to hide his bike. We're going down into the barriers, Eddie said, and suddenly shivered. Mike nodded it again. There was a moment of quiet, still that while they looked around at each other, when Bill got to his feet, and the others rose with him. I want you all to be careful for the rest of the night, Mike said. It's been here, it can be whenever you are, but this meeting has made me feel better. He looked at Bill. I'd say it still can be done. Wouldn't you, Bill? Bill nodded slowly. Yes, I think it still can be done. It will know that too, Mike said, and it will do whatever it can to slug the odds in its favor. What do we do if it shows up? Richie asked. Hold our noses, shut our eyes, turn around 3 times, and think good thoughts, puff some magic dust in its face, sing old Elvis Presley songs. What? Mike shook his head. If I could tell you that, there would be no problem, would there? All I know is that there's another force, at least there was when we were kids, that wanted us to stay alive and to do the job. Maybe it's still there. He shrugged. It was a wary gesture. I thought, too, maybe as many as 3 of you would be gone by the time we started our meeting tonight, missing or dead. Just seeing you turn up gave me reason to hope. Richie looked at his watch. 1:15. How the time flies when you're having fun, right, Haystack? Beep, beep, Richie, Ben said and smiled wanly. You want to walk back to the town house with me, Beverly? Bill asked. All right. She was putting on her coat. The library seemed very silent now. Shadowy, frightened, and Bill felt the last 2 days catching up with him all at once, pilling up on his back. If it had just been weariness, that would have been okay, but it was more a feeling that he was cracking up, dreaming, having delusion of paranoia, a sensation of being watched. Maybe I'm really not here at all, he thought. Maybe I'm in Dr. Stewart's lunatic asylum with the Count's crumbling down townhouse next door, and Renfield just across the hall, him with his flies, and me with my monsters, both of us sure the party is really going on, and dressed to the nines for it, not in tuxedos, but in straight waistcoats. What about you, Richie? Richie shook his head. I'm going to let Haystack and Caspack lead me home, he said. Right, fellers? Sure, Ben said. He looked briefly at Beverly, who was standing close to Bill, and felt a pain he had almost forgotten. A new memory trembled almost within his grasp. They floated away. What about you, Mike? Bill asked. Want to talk with Bev and me? Bill shook his head. I've got to. That was when Beverly screamed a high-pitched sound in the stillness. The vaulted dome overhead picked it up, and the echoes were like the laughter of banshees flying and flapping around them. Bill turned toward her. Richie dropped his sport coat. As he was taking it off the back of his chair, there was a crash of glass as Eddie's arm swept an empty gin bottle onto the floor. Beverly was backing away from them, her hands held out, her face as white as good bound paper. Her eyes, deep in dusky purple sockets, bulged. My hands, she screamed. My hands! What? Bill began, and then he saw the blood dripping slowly between her shaking fingers. He started forward and felt sudden lines of painful warmth cross his own hands. The pain was not sharp. It was more like the pain one sometimes feels in an old healed wound. The old scars on his palm, the ones which had reappeared in England, had broken open and were bleeding. He looked sideways and saw Eddie Kasprak peering stupidly down at his own hands. They were also bleeding. So were Mike's and Richie's and Ben's. We're in it to the end, aren't we? Beverly said. She had begun to cry. The sound was also magnificent in the library, still emphasis. The building itself seemed to be weeping with her. Bill thought that if he had to listen to that sound for long, he would go mad. God help us. We're in it to the end, she sobbed, and a runner of snot depended from one of her nostrils. She wiped it off with the back of one shaking hand, and more blood dripped on the floor. Quick, Bill said, and seized Eddie's hand. What? Quick! He held out his other hand, and after a moment, Beverly took it. She was still crying. Yes, Mike said. He looked dazed, almost drugged. Yes, that's right, isn't it? It's starting again, isn't it, Bill? It's all starting to happen again. Yes, I think. Mike took Eddie's hand, and Richie took Beverly's other hand. For a moment, Ben only looked at them, and then, like a man in a dream, he raised his bloody hands to either side and stepped between Mike and Richie. He grasped their hands. The circle closed. Ah, Chud, this is the ritual of Chud, and the turtle cannot help us. Bill tried to scream, but no sound came out. He saw Eddie's head tilt back, the cords on his neck standing out. Bev's hips bucked twice furiously, as if in an orgram's as short and sharp as the crack of a .22 pistol. Mike's mouth moved strangely, seeming to laugh, a grimace at the same time. In the silence of the library, doors banged open and shut, the sound rolling like bowling balls. In the Pendracle room, magazines flew in a windless hurricane. In Carl Danner's office, the library IBM typewriter whirled into life and typed Hebrews. His figured against the post, and still he insists. He sees the ghost. Says he thrust his fist against the post. The type ball jammed. The typewriter sizzled, and the utter a thick electric belch as everything inside overloaded. In stack two, the shelf of oculate books suddenly tipped over, spilling Edgar Cayce, Nostradamus, Charles Fort, and the apoplectic everywhere. Bill felt an exhilarating sense of power. He was dimly aware that he had an erection, and that every hair on his head was standing up straight. The sense of force in the complete circle was incredible. All the doors in the library slammed shut in unison. The grandfather clock behind the checkout desk chimed once. Then it was gone, as if someone had flicked off a switch. They dropped their hands, looking at each other. Dazed, no one said anything. As the sense of power ebbed, Bill felt a terrible sense of doom creeped over him. He looked at their white, strained face and then down at his hand. Blood was smeared there, but the wounds which Stan Iris had made with a jagged piece of Coke bottle in August 1958 had closed up, leaving only crooked white lines like nodding twice. He thought, that was the last time the seven of us were together, the day Stan made those cuts in the Barrens. Stan's not here. He's dead, and this is the last time the six of us are going to be together. I knew it. I feel it. Beverly was pressed against him, trembling. Bill put an arm around her. They all looked at him, their eyes huge and bright. In the dimness, the long table where they had sat, littered with empty bottles, glasses, and overflow ashtrays. A little island of light. That's enough, Bill said huskily. Enough entertainment for one evening. We'll save the ballroom dancing for another time. I remember, Beverly said. She looked up at Bill, her eyes huge, her pale cheeks wet. I remember everything. My father finding out about you guys, running, Bowers and Chris and Huggins, how I ran, the tunnel, the birds. I remember everything. Yeah, Richie said. I do too. Eddie nodded. The pumping station, Bill said, and how Eddie... Go back now, Mike said. Get some rest. It's late. Walk with us, Mike, Beverly said. No, I have to lock up, and I have to write a few things down. The minutes of the meeting, if you like. I won't be long. Go ahead. They moved towards the door, not talking much. Bill and Beverly were together. Eddie, Richie, and Ben behind them. Bill held the door for her, and she murmured thanks as she went out onto the wide garret steps. Bill thought how young she looked, how vulnerable. He was dimly aware that he might be falling in love with her again. He tried to think of Audrey, but Audrey seemed far away. She would be sleeping in their house in Fleet now as the sun came up and the milkman began his rounds. Derry's sky had clouded over again, and a low ground fog lay across the empty street in thick runners. Farther up the street, the Derry Community House narrow, tall, Victorian, broody in blackness. Bill thought, and whatever walked in Community House walked alone. He had sniffled a wild cackle. Their football seemed very loud. Beverly's hand touched his, and Bill took it gratefully. It started before we were ready, she said. Would we ever have been ready? You would have been, Big Bill. The touch of her hand was suddenly both wonderful and necessary. He wondered what it would be like to touch her breasts for the second time in his life, and suspected that before this long night was over, he would know fuller now, mature, in his hand would have fine hair when he cupped the swelling of her mom's Vernoness. He thought, I loved you, Beverly. I love you. Ben loved you. He loves you. We loved you. Then, we loved you now. We better, because it started. No way out now. He glanced behind and saw the library half a block away. Richie and Eddie were on the top step. Ben was standing at the bottom, looking after them. His hands were stuffed in his pocket. His shoulders were slumped. And then through the drifting lens of the low fog, he might almost have been 11 again. If he had been able to send Ben a thought, Bill would have sent this one. It doesn't matter, Ben. The love is what matters, the carrying. It's always the desire, never the time. Maybe that's all we get to take with us when we go out of the blue and into the black. Cold comfort, maybe, but better than no comfort at all. My father knew, Beverly said suddenly. I came home one day from the Barriers, and he just knew. Did I ever tell you that what he used to say to me when he was mad? What? I worry about you, Bevy. That's what he used to say. I worry a lot. She laughed and shivered at the same time. I think he meant to hurt me, Bill. I mean, he'd hurt me before, but the last time was different. He was, well, in many ways he was a strange man. I loved him very much, but... She looked at him, perhaps wanting him to say it for her. He wouldn't. It was something she was going to have to say for herself. Sooner or later, lies and self-deception had become a ballast they could not afford. I hated him too, she said, and her hand bore down conventionally upon Bill's for a long second. I never told that to anyone in my life before. I thought God would strike me dead if I ever said it out loud. Say it again, then. No, go on. It'll hurt, but maybe it's fester in there long enough. Say it. I hated my dad, she said, and began to sob helplessly. I hated him. I was scared of him. I hated him. I could never been good enough girl to suit him, and I hated him. I did, but I loved him too. He stopped and held her tight. Her arms went around him in a panicky grip. Her tears wet the side of his neck. He was very conscious of her body, ripe and firm. He moved his torso away from hers, slightly, not wanting her to feel the erection he was getting, but she moved against him again. We'd spent the morning down there, she said, playing tag or something like that, something harmless. We hadn't even talked about it that day. At least not then. We usually talk about it every day. At some point, though. Remember? Yes, he said. At some point, I remember. It was overcast hot. We played most of the morning. I went home around 11:30. I thought I'd have a sandwich and a bowl of soup after I took a shower, and then I'd go back and played some more. My parents were both working, but it was there. He was home. He, too. Lower Main Street, 11:30 a.m. Threw her across the room before she had even got all the way through the door. A startled scream was jerked out of her and then cut off as she hit the wall with shoulder-numbing force. She collapsed onto their sagging sofa, looking around wildly. The door to the front hall banged shut. Her father had been standing behind it. I worry about you, Bevy, he said. Sometimes I worry a lot. You know that? I tell you that, don't I? You bet I do. Daddy, what? He was walking slowly toward her across the living room, his face thoughtful, sad, deadly. She didn't want to see that last, but it was there, like the blind shine of dirt on still water. He was nibbling reflectiveness on a knuckle of his right hand. He was dressed in his khakis, and when she glanced down, she saw that his high-top shoes were leaving tracks on her mother's carpet. I'll have to get the vacuum out, she thought, incorrectly. Vacuum that up. If he leaves me able to vacuum. It was mud, black mud. Her mind slipped. Alarmingly, she was back in the barriers with Bill, Richie, Eddie, and the others. There was black, vicious mud, like the kind on Daddy's shoes, down there in the barriers, in the swampy place where the stuff Richie called bamboo stood in a skeletal white grove. When the wind blew, the stalks rattled together hollowly, producing a sound like voodoo drums. And had her father been down in the barriers, had her father whap his hand rocket down in the wide, steepy orbit and struck her face, her head funded back against the wall. He hooked at his thumbs in his belt and looked at her with that expression of deadly disconnected curiosity. She felt a trickle of blood running warmly from the left corner of her own lower lip. I have seen you getting big, he said, and she thought he would say something more. But for the time being, that seemed to be all. Daddy, what are you talking about? She asked in a low, trembling voice. If you lie to me, I'll beat you within an inch of your life, Bevy, he said. And she realized with horror that he was looking at her. He was looking at the cure and Ives picture over her head on the wall above the sofa. Her mind side-slipped crazily again, and she was 4, sitting in the bathtub with her blue plastic boat and her Popeye soap. Her father, so big and so well-loved, was kneeling beside her, dressed in gray twill pants and a strappy T-shirt, a washcloth in one hand and a glass of orange soda in the other, soaping her back and saying, Let me see those ears, Bevy. Your ma needs taters for supper. And she could hear her small self giggling, looking up at his sightless, grizzled face, which she had then believed must be internal. I won't lie, Daddy, she said. What's wrong? Her view of him was gradually shivering apart as the tears came. You've been down there in the barriers with a gang of boys. Her heart limped. Her eyes dropped to his mud-caked shoes again. That black, clingly mud. If you step into it too deep, it would suck your sneakers or your loafer right off. And both Richie and Bill believed that. If you went in all the way, it turned to quick mud. I played down there summit Whap! The hand covered with hard collapse, rocketed down again. She cried out, hurt, afraid. That look on his face scared her, and the way he wouldn't look at her scared her, too. There was something wrong with him. He had been getting worse. What if he meant to kill her? What if... Oh, stop it, Beverly. He's your father, and fathers don't kill daughters. He lost control then. What if? What have you let them to do to you? Do want... She had no idea what he meant. Take your pants off? Her confusion increased. Nothing he said seemed connected to anything else. Trying to follow him made her feel ill, seasick, almost... What? Why? His hand rose. She flinched back. Take them off, Bevy. I want to see if you are intact. Now, there was a new image, crazier than the rest. She saw herself pulling her jeans off and one of her legs coming off with them, her father belting her around the room as she tried to hop away from him on her one good leg. Daddy shouted, I knew you wasn't intact. I knew it. I knew it. Daddy, I don't want... His hand came down, not slapping this time, but clutching a bit into her shoulder with furious strength. She screamed. He pulled her up and for the first time looked directly into her eyes. She screamed again at what she saw there. It was nothing. Her father was gone, and Beverly suddenly understood that she was alone in the apartment with it. Alone with it on this dozy August morning. There was not the fixed sense of power and undefeatable evil she had felt in the house on the Neobolt Street. A week and a half ago, it had been dwelt in somehow by her father's essential humanity, but it was here, working through him. He saw her aside. She struck the coffee table, tipped over it, and went sprawling on the floor with a cry. This is how it happens, she thought. I'll tell Bill so he understands. It's everywhere in Derry. It just fills the hollow places, that's all. She rolled over. Her father was walking toward her. She skidded away from him on the seat of her jeans, her hair and her eyes. I know you've been down there, he said. I was told. I didn't believe it. I didn't believe my Bevy would be hanging around with a gang of boys. Then I seen you myself this morning. My Bevy with a bunch of boys, not even 12, and hanging around with a bunch of boys. This latter thought seemed to send him into a fresh rage. It trembled through his scar-away frame like Volt's, not even 12 years old. He shouted and fetched a kick at her thigh that made her scream. His jaws snapped over this fact or concept or whatever it was to him, like the jaws of a hungry dog worrying a piece of meat. Not even 12. Not even 12. Not even 12! He kicked. Beverly scrambled away. They had worked their way into the kitchen arena of the apartment now. His work boots struck the drawer under the stove, making the pots and pans inside jangle. Don't you run from me, Bevy, he said. You don't want to do that or it'll be the worse for you. Believe me now. Believe me, your dad, this is serious. Hanging around with the boys, letting them do God knows what to do. Not even 12. That's serious. Christ knows. He grabbed her and jerked her to her feet by her shoulder. You're a pretty girl, he said. There's plenty of people happy to ruin a pretty girl. Plenty of pretty girls willing to be root. You being slut-child to them boys, Bevy. At last she understood what it had put in his head, except part of her knew the thought might almost have been there all along, that it might only have used the tools that had been there just lying around waiting to pick up. No, Daddy, I seen you smoking, he bellowed. This time he struck her with the palm of his hand, hard enough to send her reeling back in the drunken strides to the kitchen table, where she sprawled, a flare of agony in the small of her back. The salt and pepper shakers fell to the floor. The pepper shaker broke. Black flowers bloomed and disappeared. Before her eyes, sound seemed too deep. She saw his face, something in his face. He was looking at her chest. She was suddenly aware that her blouse had come untucked, and that she wasn't wearing a bra. As of yet, she owned only a training bra. Her mind slipped back to the house at Neobolt Street when Bill had given her his shirt. Had been unaware of the way her breasts poked at the thin cotton material, but their occasional skittering glances had not bothered her. These had seemed perfectly naturally, and Bill's look had seemed more than natural. It had seemed warm and wanted it deeply dangerous. Now she felt guilt mixed with her terror. Was her father so wrong? Hadn't she had you been a slut child to them? Thoughts, bad thoughts, thoughts of whatever it was that he was talking about. It's not the same thing. It's not the same thing as the way. You've been a slut child. He's looking at me now. Not the same. She tucked her blouse back in. Bevy, Daddy, we just played, that's all. We played. We don't do anything bad. I seen you smoking, he said again, walking towards her, his eyes moving across her chest and her narrow, uncurved hips. He chanted suddenly in a high school boy's voice that frightened her even more. A girl who will chew gum will smoke. A girl who will smoke will drink. And a girl who will drink. Everyone knows what a girl like that will do. I didn't do anything! She screamed at him as his hands descended on her shoulders. He was not pitching or hurting now. His hands were gentle, and that was somehow scariest at all. Beverly, he said with an inarguable mad logic of the total obsessed. I seen you with boys. Now you want to tell me what a girl does with boys down in all that trash wood, if it ain't what a girl does on her back. Let me alone, she cried at him. The anger flashed up from a deep well she had never suspected. The anger made a blushed yellow flame in her head. It threatened her thoughts. All the times he had scared her, all the times he had slammed her, all the times he had hurt her. You just let me alone. Don't talk to your daddy like that, he said, sounding stoned. I didn't do what you're saying. I never did. Maybe not. I'm going to check and make sure I know how. Take your pants off. No. His eyes widened, showing yellow corridor all the way around deep blue irises. What did you say? I said, no. His eyes were fixed on hers, and perhaps he saw the blazing anger there, the bright upsurge of rebellion. Who told you, Bevy? Who told you we played down here? Was it a stranger? Was it a man dressed in orange and silver? Did he wear gloves? Did he look like a clown even if he wasn't a clown? What was his name? Bevy, you want to stop. No, you want to stop, she told him. He swung his hand. Again, not open, but this time closed in a fist meant to break something. Beverly ducked. His fist whistled over her head and crashed into the wall. He howled and let go of her, putting the fist to his mouth. She backed away from him in quick, menacing steps. You come back here. No, she said. You want to hurt me? I love you, Daddy, but I hate you when you're like this. You can't do it anymore. It's making you do it, but you let it in. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, but you better get over to me. I am going to ask you no more. No, she said, beginning to cry again. Don't make me come over there and collect you, Bevy. You're going to be one sorry little girl if I have to do that. Come to me. Tell me who told you, she said, and I will. He leapt at her with such scrawny cat-like agony that, although she suspected such a leap was coming, she was almost caught. She fumbled for the kitchen doorknob, pulled the door open just wide enough so she could slip through, and then she was running down the hall toward the front door, running in a dream of panic, as she would run from Mrs. Crash. 27 years later, behind her, Al Marsh crashed against the door, slamming it shut again, cracking it down the center. You get back here right now, Bevy! He howled, yanking it open and coming after her. The front door was on the latch. She had come home the back way, One of her trembling hands worked at the lock while the other yanked fruitlessly at the knob behind her father. She howled again, the sound of an "Take those pants off, slut child!" animal. She turned the lock knob, and the front door finally swept open. Hot breath plunged up and down in her throat. She looked over her shoulder and saw him right behind her, reaching for her, grinning and grimacing his yellow horsen teeth, a bear trap in his mouth. Beverly bolted out for the screen door and felt his fingers skid down the back of her blouse without catching hold. She flew down the steps, overbalanced, and went sprawling on the considering walkway, erasing the skin from both knees. "You get back here now, Bevy, or before God, I'll whip the skin off you." He came down the steps, and she scrambled to her feet, holes in the legs of her jeans. "Your pants off." Her kneecaps sizzling blood, exposed nerve endings singing onward, Christian soldiers. She looked back, and he came again. Al Marsh, janitor in custody, and gray man dressed in Kanaka pants and Kanaka shirts with two flap pockets, a key ring attached to his belt by a chain, his hair flying, but he wasn't in his eyes. The essential, he who had washed her back and punched her in the gut, and had done both because he was worried about her. Worried a lot. He who had once tried to braid her hair when she was 7, made a botch of it, and then got giggling with her about the way it stuck out every way. He who knew how to make cinnamon eggnogs on Sunday that tasted better than anything you could buy for a quarter at the dairy post from that utter sexual state. None of them was in his eyes now. She saw blank murder there. She saw it there. She ran from it. Mr. Pasquale looked up, startled from where he was watering his crab-grassy lawn and listening to the Red Sox game on a portable radio sitting on his porch rail. The Zinnerman kids stood back from the old Hudson Hornet, which they had brought for $25, and watched almost every day. One of them was holding a hose, the other a bucket of soap suds. Both were slack-jawed. Mrs. Denton looked out of her second-floor apartment, one of her 6 daughters' dresses in her lap, more mended in a basket on the floor, her mouth full of pins. Little Lars, Firminus pulled his red ball flyer wagon quickly off the cracked sidewalk and stood on Bucky Pasquale's dying lawn. He burst into tears as Bevy, who had spent a patient morning that spring showing him how to tie his sneakers so they would stay tied, flashed by him, screaming her eyes wide. A moment later, her father passed hollering at her, and Lars, who was then free and who would die 12 years later in a motorcycle accident, saw something terrible and inhuman in Mr. Marsh's face. He had nightmares for 3 weeks after, and then he saw Mr. Marsh turning into a spider inside his closet. Beverly ran. She was perfectly aware that she might be running for her life. If her father caught her now, it wouldn't matter that they were on the street. People did crazy things in Derry sometimes. She didn't have to read the newspaper or know the town's particular history to understand that if he caught her, he would choke her or beat her or kick her. And when it was over, someone would come and collect him, and he would sit in a cell the way Eddie Corrigan's stepfather was sitting in a cell, dazed and uncomprehended. She ran towards downtown, passing more and more people as she went. They started first at her, then at her person father, and they looked surprised, some of them even amazed, but that was on their faces. Went no further. They looked, and then they went on toward whenever they had been going. The air circulating in her lungs was growing heavier now. She crossed the canal, feet pounding on cement, while cars rumbled over the heavy wooden slats of the bridge to her right. To her left, she could see the stone circulum where the canal went under the downtown arena. She cut suddenly across Main Street, obviously to the honking horns and squealing brakes. She went right because the barrier lays in that direction. It was still almost a mile away, and if she was to get there, she would somehow have to outdistance her father on the grueling slope of Up Mile Hill, or one of the even steeper side streets. But that was all there was. "Come back here, you little bitch! I'm warning you!" As she gained the sidewalk on the far side of the street, she snatched another glance behind her, the heavy weight of her red hair shifting over her shoulder. As she did, her father was crossing the street, as heedless of the traffic as she had been, his face a bright sweaty red. She ducked down an alley that ran behind Warehouse Row. This was the rear of the buildings which fronted on Up Mile Hill. Star, Brief, Armorer, Meatpacking, Hep Hill, Storage, and Warehousing, Eagle, Beef and Kosher Meats. The alley was narrow and cobble, made narrower still by the bunches of thumbing garbage cans and bins set out here. The cobbles were slimly with God knew what awful and order. There was a mixture of smells, some bland, some sharp, some simply titanic, but all spoke of meat and slaughter. Files buzzed in clouds from inside one of the buildings. She could hear the blood curdle and whine of bone saws. Her feet stuttered unevenly on the slick cobbles. One hit struck a Gavilis garage. Can and packages of tripe wrapped in newspaper fell out like great meaty juggle blossoms. "You get right the hell back here, Bevy. I mean it now. Don't make it any worse than it already is, girl." Two men lunged in the loaded doorway of the Kirschen Packing Works, munching fixed sandwiches, open dinner buckets near at hand. "You in a woeful place, girl," one of them said mildly. "Looks like you going in the woodsheds with your pa." The other laughed. He was gaining. She could hear his thunder, footfalls, and heavy reparations almost behind her now. Looking to her right, she could see the black wing of his shadow flying along the high board fence there. Then he yelled in surprise and fury as his feet slipped out from under him, and he thumped to the cobblestone. He was up a moment later, no longer below in words, but only shrinking out his incorrected fury, while the men in the doorway laughed and slapped each other on the back. The alley zigged to the left, and Beverly came to the skirt and halt, her mouth opening in dismay. A city dumpster was parked across the alley's mouth. There was not even 9 inches of clearance on either side. Its motor was idling under that sound, barely audible. She could hear the murmur of conversation from the dumpster's cab. More men on lunch break. It lacked no more than 3 or 4 minutes of noon. Soon the courthouse clock would begin to chime the hour. She could hear him coming again, closing in. She threw herself down and hooked her way under the dumpster, using her elbows with wounded knees. The stink of exhaust and diesel's fuel mixed with the smell of ripe meats and made her feel a kind of giddy nuisance. In a way, the ease of her process was worse. She was skinned greasily over a coat of slime and garbage crude. She kept moving once too high off the cobbles so that her back came in contact with the dumpster's hot exhaust pipe. She had to bite back a scream. "Beverly, you under there?" Each word separated from last by an out-of-breath gasp for air. She looked back and met his eyes as he bent and peered under the truck. "Leave me alone," she managed. "You bitch," he replied in a thick, spit-choked voice. He threw himself flat. Keys jingling began to crawl after her, using a Groswick swimming stroke to pull himself along. Beverly clawed her way from under the truck's cab, grabbed one of the huge tires. Her fingers hooked their way into a Fred up to the second knuckle and yanked herself up. She banged her tailbone on the dumpster front bumper, and then she was running, heading up mile now, her blouse and jeans smeared with goop and stink into high heaven. She looked back and saw her father's hand and freckled arms shoot out from under the dumpster's cab, like the claws of some imagined childhood monster from under the bed. Quickly, hardly thinking at all, she darted between Fieldsman Storage and the Tracker Brothers, annexed this convert, to narrow, even to be called an alley, was filled with broken crates, weeds, sunflowers, and of course more garbage. Beverly dived behind a pile of crates and crouched there. A few moments later, she saw her father pound by the mouth of the convert and on up the hill. Beverly got up and hurried to the far end of the convert. There was a chain link fence here. She monkeyed to the top, got over, and worked her way down the far side. She was now on Dairy Theological Seminary fraternity. She ran up the magical black lawn and around the side of the building. She could hear someone inside playing something classical on an organ. The notes seemed to engrave their pleasant, calm sleeves on the still air. There was a tall hedge between the cemetery and Kansas Street. She peered through it and saw her father on the far side of the street, breathing hard, patching of sweat, darkening his work shirt under the arms. He was peering around, hands on hips. His key ring twinkled brightly in the sun. Beverly watched them, also breathing hard, her heart beating rapid fast in her throat. She was very thirsty, and her simmering smell disgusted her. If I was drawn in a comic strip, she thought distractedly, there'd be all those wavy stink lines coming up from me. Her father crossed slowly to the cemetery side. Beverly's breath stopped. Please, God, I can't run. Help me, God. Don't let him find me. Almost walked slowly down the sidewalk, directly past where his daughter crouched on the far side of the hedge. Dear God, don't let him smell me. He didn't, perhaps, because after a tumble in the alleyway and crawling up under the dumpster himself, Al smelled as bad as she did. He walked on. She watched him go, back down up Mile Hill, until he was out of sight. Beverly picked herself up. Slowly her clothes were covered with garbage. Her face was dirty. Her back hurt, where she had burned it on the exhaust pipe of the dumpsters. Their physical things paled before the confused swirl of her thoughts. She felt that she had sailed off the edge of the world, and none of the normal patterns of behavior seemed to apply. She could not imagine going home, but she could not imagine not going home. She had to find her father, to find him. She had to push that thought away because it made her feel weak and trembling, sick to her stomach. She loved her father. Wasn't one of the 10 commandments, honor thy mother and father, that the days may be long upon the earth? Yes, but he hadn't been himself, hadn't been her father, had in fact been someone completely different, an imposter. Suddenly she went cold as a terrible question occurred to her. Was this happening to the others or something like it? She ought to warn them. They had heard it, and perhaps now it was taking steps to assure itself. They would never hurt it again, and really, where else was there to go? They were the only friends she had. Bill would know what to do. Bill would tell her what to do. Bill would suddenly, though, what next? She stopped where the cemetery walk joined the Kansas Street sidewalk and peered around the hedge. Her father was truly gone. She turned right and began to walk along Kansas Street toward the barriers. Probably none of them would be there now. They would be at home eating their lunches, but they would be back. Meantime, she could go down the cool clubhouse and try to get herself under some kind of control. She would leave the little window open so she could have some sunshine, and perhaps she would even be able to sleep. Her tired body An overstrained mind grasped eagerly at the thought. Sleep, yes, that would be good. Her head drooped as she plodded past the last bunch of houses. Before the land grew too steep for houses and plunged down into the barrens. The barrens were as incredible as it seemed to her. Her father had been lurking and spying. She certainly did not hear the footfalls behind her. The boys there were at great pains to be quiet. They had been outrun before. They did not intend to be outrun again. They drew closer and closer to her. Walk and Cat, Soft, Belch, and Victor were grinning, but Henry's face was both vacant and serious. His hair was uncombed and snarly. His eyes were as unfocused as Al Marsh's had been. In the apartment, he held one dirty finger pressed over his lips in a gesture as they closed the distance from 70 feet to 50 to 30. Through that summer, Henry had been edging steadily out over some mental abyss, walking on a bridge that had grown restlessly more and more narrow on the day when he had allowed Patrick Hawksgetter to caress him. That bridge had narrowed to a tight rope. The tight rope had snapped. This morning he had gone into the yard, naked except for his rag yellowing under shorts, and looked up into the sky. The ghost of the last night's moon still lingered there, and as he looked at it, the moon had suddenly changed into a skeletal grinning face. Henry had fallen on his knees before this face exulted with terror and joy. Ghost voices came from the moon. The voices changed sometimes, seemed to merge together in a soft babble that was barely understandable. But he sensed the truth, which was simply that all these voices were one voice, one intelligence. The voice told him to hunt up Belch and Victor and be at the corner of Kansan Street and Costello Avenue around noon. The voice told him he would know how to do then. Sure enough, the cunt had come bopping along. He waited to hear what the voice would tell him to do next. The answer came as they continued to close the distance. The voice came out from the moon, but from the sewer garrison they were passing. The voice was low but clear. Belch and Victor glanced toward the Granton in a dazed, almost hypnotized way, then back at Beverly. Kill her, the voice from the sewer said. Henry Bowers reached into the pocket of his jeans and brought out a slim 9-inch-long instrument with imitation ivory inlays along its side. A small Corrani button glinted at one end of this. Demonis object d'art. Henry pushed it. A 6-inch blade popped out of the slit at the end of the handle. He bounced the switchblade on his palm. He began to walk a little faster. Victor and Belch, still looking dazed, increased their own walking speed to keep up with him. Beverly did not hear them precisely. That was not what made her turn her head as Henry Bowers closed the distance. Bent kneed, shuffling, a frozen grin on his face. Henry was as silent as an Indian. No, it was simply a feeling too clear and distinct and powerful to be denied of. 3. The Derry Public Library. 1:55 a.m. Of being watched. Mike Hanlon let his pen aside and looked across the shadow and inverted bowl of the library's main room. He saw islands of light thrown by the hanging globes. He saw books fading into dimness. He saw the iron staircase making their graceful trellis spirals up to the stacks. He saw nothing out of the place. All the same, he did not believe he was alone in here. Not anymore. After the others were gone, Mike had cleaned up with a care that was only habit. He was on autopilot, his mind a million miles and 27 years away. He dumped ashtrays, threw away the empty liquor bottles, put in a layer of waste over them so that Carnal wouldn't be shocked. and the returnable cans in a box behind his desk. Then he got the broom and swept up the remains of the gin bottle Eddie had broken. When the table was clean, he went into the Pendranolical's room and picked up the scattered magazines. As he did these simple chores, his mind shifted the stories they had told consideration, the most perhaps on what they had left out. They believed they remember everything, he thought, that Bill and Beverly almost did. But there was more. It would come to them if it allowed them the time in 1958. There had been no chance for preparation. They had talked endlessly, their talk interrupted only by the rock fight and that one active group, Himerosen at 29 Neobolt Street, and might in the end have done so no more than talk. Then August 14 had come, and Henry and his friends had simply chased them into the sewers. Maybe I should have told them, he thought, put in the last of the magazines back in their places. But something spoke strongly against the idea, the voice of the turtle. He supposed perhaps that was part of it, and perhaps that sense of circulus was part of it too. Maybe that last act was going to repeat itself in some updated fashion as well. He had put flashlights and miners' helmets carefully by against tomorrow. He had the blueprints of the dairy sewer and drain systems neatly rolled up and held with rubber bands in that same closet by when they were kids. All their talk and all their plans, half-baked or otherwise, had come to nothing in the end. In the end, they had simply been chased into the drains, hurled into the confrontation which had followed. What was that going to happen again? Faith and power, he had come to believe, were inchangeable. Was the final truth even simpler, that no act of faith was possible until you were rudely pushed out into the screaming middle of things like a newborn child, skydiving chutelessly out of his mother's womb? Once you were fallen, you were forced to believe in the chute, into the existence, weren't you? Pulling the ring as you fell became your final substitute on the subject. One way or the other. Jesus Christ, it's Felton She in blackface. Mike thought and laughed a little. Mike cleaned, kneaded, and fought his thoughts, while another part of his brain accepted that he would finish and find himself tired enough to go home and sleep for a few hours. But when he finally did finish, he found himself as wide awake as ever. So he went to the single closed stack behind his office, unlocking the wire gate with a key from his ring and letting himself in. This stack supposedly fireproof when the vault type door was closed and looked continued. The library's valuable first editions, book signs by writers long since dead. Among the signed editions were Moby Dick and Winsman's Leaves of Grass, heroical matter related to the town, and the personal papers of a few of the few writers who had lived and worked in Derry. Mike hoped if all of this ended well, persuade Bill to leave this manuscript to the public library. Walking down the third aisle of the stack beneath tin-shaded light bulbs, smelling the familiar library sense of must and dust and cinnamony again in the paper, he thought. When I die, I guess I'll go with a library card in one hand and an overdue stamp in the other. Well, maybe there's worse ways. He stopped halfway down this third aisle. His dog-eared stento notebook, which contained the jotted tales of Derry and his own troubled wanders, was tucked between Frederick's old Derry town and Mitchard's history of Derry. He had pushed the notebook so far back it was nearly invisible. No one would stumble across it unless he was looking for it. Mike took it and went back to the table where they had held their meeting, pausing to turn off the lights in the closed stack and to relock the wire mesh. He sat down and flipped through the pages he had written, thinking of what a strange cripple adamant it was. part history, part scandal, part diary, part confessional. He had not logged an entry since April 6th. Have to get a new book soon, he thought, tumbling the few blank pages that were left. He thought bosom for a moment of Margaret Mitchell's first draft of Gone with the Wind, written in longhand and stacks of school compassionate books. Then he uncaped his pen and wrote May 31st, 2 lines below the end of his last entry. He paused, looking vaguely across the empty library, and then began to write about everything that had happened during the last 3 days, beginning with his telephone call to Stanley Uris. He wrote quietly for 15 minutes, and then his concentration began to come unravel. He paused more and more frequently. The image of Stan Uris's severed head in the refrigerator tried to intrude Stan's bloody head, the mouth open and full of feathers falling out of the refrigerator and rolling across the floor toward him. He banished it with an effort and went on writing. 5 minutes later, he jerked upright and looked around, convinced he would see that head rolling across the old black and red tiles of the main floor, eyes as glassy and a weed as those in the mounted head of a deer. There was nothing, no head, no sound, except the muffled drums of his own heart. Got to get a hold of yourself, Mikey. It's the Jim Jams, that's all. Nothing else to do it. But it was no use. The words began to get away from him. The thoughts seemed to dangle just out of reach. There was a pressure on the back of his neck, and it seemed to grow heavier. Being watched. He put his pen down and got up from the table. Is anyone here? He called, and his voice echoed back from the rotary, giving him a jolt. He licked his lips and tried again. Bill, Ben. And suddenly Mike decided he wanted to be home. He would simply take the notebook with him. He reached for it and heard a faint sliding footstep. He looked up again, pools of light surrounded by deepening lagoons of shadow. Nothing else, at least nothing he could see. He waited, heart beating hard. The footsteps came again, and this time he pinpointed the location. The glass-in passageway that connected the adult library to the children's library in there. Something, moving quietly. Mike walked across to the checkout desk. The double doors leading into the passageway were held by wooden chalks, and he could see a little way in. He could see what looked like feet, and with sudden swoon and horror, he wondered if maybe Stan had come after all, if maybe Stan was going to step out of the shadows with his birds encoupled in one hand, his face white, his lips purple, his wrists and forearms cut open. I finally came, Stan would say. It took me a while because I had to pull myself most of the hole in ground, but I finally came. There was another footstep, and now Mike could see shoes. For sure, shoes and rag demon pant legs, faded blue strings hung down against sockless ankles, and in the darkness almost 6 feet above those ankles, he could see glittering eyes. He groped over the surface of the similar checkout desk and felt along the other side without taking his gaze from those eyes. His fingers felt one wooden corner of a small box, the overdue card, a smaller box, paper clips, and rubber bands. They happened on something that was metal and seized it. It was a letter opener with the words Jesus Saves stamped on the handle, a flimsy thing that had come in the mail from the Grace Baptist Church as part of a fundraising drive. Mike had not attended service in 15 years, but Grace Baptist had been his mother's church, and he had sent them $5 he could not really afford. He had meant to throw the letter opener out, but it had stayed here, amid the clutter on his side of the desk. Carlos's side was always spotless clean until now. He clutched it tightly and stared into the shadowy hallway. There was another step. Another. Now the rag demon pants were visible up to the knees. He could see the shape these lower legs belonged to. It was big, hulking. The shoulders was rounded. There was a suggestion of ragged hair. The figure was ape-like. "Who are you?" The shape merely stood there, contempling him, although still afraid. Mike had gotten over the debilitating idea that it might be Stan Eris, returned from the grave, called back by the scars on his palm, some electric magnetism which had brought him back like a zombie in a Hammer horror film. Whenever this was, it wasn't Stan, who had finished at 5'7", when he had his full growth. The shape took another step, and now the light from the globe closet to the passageway fell across the beltless loops of the jeans around the shape's waist. Suddenly, Mike knew even more the shape spoke. He knew. "Hello, nigger," the shape said. "Been throwing rocks at anyone? Want to know who poisoned your fucking dog?" The shape took another step forward, and the light fell on the face of Henry Bowers. It had grown fat and sagging. The skin had been unhealthy, tallow in hue. The cheeks had become hanging jowls that were specked with stubble, almost as much white in the stubble as black. Wavy lines, three of them, were engraved in the shelf of the forehead, above the bushy browns. Another line formed, parentiness, at the inside decolored portions of flesh, bloodshots, and thoughtfulness. It was the face of a man being pushed into a premature age, a man who was 39 going on 73, but it was also the face of a 12-year-old boy. Henry's clothes were still green, with whatever bushes he had spent the day hiding in. "Ain't you gonna say howdy, nigger?" Henry asked. "Hello, Henry." It occurred to him dimly that he had not listened to the radio for the last 2 days, and he had not even read the paper, which was a ritual with him. Too much going on, too busy, too bad. Henry emerged from the corridor between the children's library and the adult library and stood there, peering at Mike with his piggy eyes, his lips parted in an unspeakable grin, revealing rotten back main teeth. "Voices," he said. "You ever hear voices, nigger?" "Which voices are these, Henry?" He put both hands behind his back, like a schoolboy called upon to recite, and transferred the letter opener from his left hand to his right. The grandfather clock given by Hostermüller in 1923 ticked Solomon seconds into the smooth pond of library silence. "From the moon," Henry said. He put a hand in his pocket. "Came from the moon. Lots of voices." He paused, frowned slightly, then shook his head. "Lots, but really only one. Its voice. Did you see it, Henry?" "Yep," Henry said. "Frankenstein tore off Victor's head. You should have heard it. Made a sound like a great big zipper going down. Then it went after Belch. Belch fought it." "Did he?" "Yep, that's how I got away." "You left him to die?" "Don't you say that." Henry's cheeks flushed a dull red. He took 2 steps forward. The farther he walked from the unconventional connecting the children's library to the adult library, the younger he looked to Mike. He saw the same old meanness in Henry's face, but he saw something else as well. The child who had been brought up by crazy Butch Bowers on a good farm that had gone to shack shambles over the years. "Don't you say that. It would have killed me too." "It didn't kill us." Henry's eyes gleamed with rinsent humor. "Not yet, but it will. At least I don't leave any of you for it to get." He pulled his hand out of his pocket. In it was a slim 9-inch long instrument with imitation ivory inlays along its sides. A small curium button glittered at one end of his dubious object art. Henry pushed it. A 6-inch steel blade popped out of the slit at the end of the handle. He bounced the switchblade on his palm and began to walk toward the checkout desk a little further, faster. "Look what I found," he said. I knew where to look. Obstinately, one red-rimmed eyelid drooped in a weak. "The man in the moon told me." Henry revealed his teeth again. "Hid today, hitched like a ride tonight. Old man hit him, killed him. I fake ditched the car over in Newport, just over the dairy down town line. I heard that voice. I looked in the drain. There was these clothes and the knife, my old knife. You're forgetting something, Henry. Henry grinned and overshook his head. We got away and you got away. If it was once us, it wants you, too. No. I think yes, maybe you yo-yos did its work, but it didn't exactly play favorites, did it? It got both of your friends, and while Belch was fighting it, you got away. But now you're back. I think you're part of its unfinished business, Henry. I really do. No. Maybe Frankenstein's what you'll see, or the werewolf, a vampire, the clown, or Henry. Maybe you'll really see what it looks like, Henry. We did. Want me to tell you? Want me to? You shut up! Henry screamed and launched himself at Mike. Mike stepped aside and stuck out one foot. Henry tripped over it and went skidding over the foot-worn tiles like a shuffleboard. Wait. His head struck the leg off the table where the losers had sat earlier that night, telling their tales. For a moment, he was stunned. The knife hung loose in his hand. Mike went after the knife. And that possible, he could have finished Henry. It would have been possible to plant to the Jesus Saves letter opener, which had come in the mail from his mother's old church in the back of Henry's neck, and then called the police. There would have been a certain amount of official nonsense, but not too much of it, not in Derry, where such weird and violent events were not entirely exceptional. What stopped him was a realization, almost too lightning like to be concision, that if he killed Henry, he would be doing its work to be conclusionist, that if he killed Henry, he would be doing its work as surely as Henry would be doing its work by killing Mike, and something else, that utter look he had seen on Henry's face, the tired, bewildered look of the badly used child who has been set on a poisonous path for some unknown purpose. Henry had grown up within the commuted radius of Butch Bauer's mind. Surely he had belonged to it even before he suspected its existence. So instead of planting the letter opener in Henry's verbal neck, he dropped to his knees and snatched at the knife. It twisted in its hand, seemingly of its own violation, and his fingers closed on the blade. There was no imitated pain, only red blood flowing down the first free fingers of his right hand and to his scarred palm. He pulled back. Henry rolled away and grabbed the knife again. Mike got to his knees, and the two of them faced each other that way, each bleeding. Mike's fingers, Henry's nose. Henry shook his head, and droplets flew away into the darkness. Thought you were so smart, he said hoarsely. Fucking sissies is all you were. We could have beat you in a fair fight. Put the knife down, Mike said quietly. I'll call the police. They'll come and get you and take you back to Jupiter Hill. You'll be out of Derry. You'll be safe. Henry tried to talk and couldn't. He couldn't tell this hateful jag that he wouldn't be safe in Jupiter Hill or Los Angeles or the rainforests of Timbuktu. Sooner or later, the moon would rise, bone white and snow cold, and the ghost voices would start, and the face of the moon would change into its face, babbling and laughing and ordering. He swallowed slick, slimy blood. You never fought fair. Did you? Mike asked. You nigger, booing, in night fighter, jungle bunny, ape, man-coon. Henry screamed and leaped at Mike again. Mike leaned back to avoid his blundering, awkward rush over balance and went sprawling on his back. Henry shook the table again, rebounded, turned, and clutched Mike's arm. Mike swept the letter opener around and felt it go deep into Henry's forearm. Henry screamed, but instead of letting go, he tightened his grip. He pulled himself toward Mike, his hair in his eyes, blood flowing from his ruptured nose over his thick lips. Mike tried to get a foot in Henry's side and pushed him away. Henry swung the switchblade in a glittering arch. All 6 inches of it went into Mike's thigh. It went in an effortless, as if into a warm cake of butter. Henry pulled it out, dripping, and it with a scream of combined pain and effort. Mike shoved him away. He struggled to his feet, but Henry was up more quickly, and Mike was barely able to avoid Henry's next blundering rush. He could feel blood pouring down his leg and an alarming flood filling his loafer. He got by Formino Archerin. I thank Jesus he got me bad. Blood everywhere. Blood on the floor. Shoes won't be any good. Shit. Just brought in 2 months ago. Henry came again, panting and puffing like a bull in heat. Mike staggered aside and swept the letter opener at him again and tore through Henry's ragged shirt and pulled a deep cut across his ribs. Henry grunted as Mike shoved him away again. You dirty fighting nigger, he wailed. Look what you done. Drop the knife, Henry, Mike said. There was a titter from behind them. Henry looked and then screamed in utter horror, clapping his hands to his cheeks like an offended old maid. Mike's gaze and jerked toward the circulation desk. There was a loud vibrating kaspong sound, and Stan Uris's head popped up from behind the desk, a spring corkscrew up and into his serve dripping necks. His face was lived with grease paint. There was a fever spot of rogue on each cheek. Great and orange pom-poms flowered where the eyes had been. This grossness stand in a box, head nodded back and forth at the end of its springs like one of the giant sunflowers beside the house on Neobold Street. Its mouth open and squealing, laughing voice began to chant, Kill him, Henry. Kill the nigger. Kill the coon. Kill him. Kill him. Kill him. Mike wheeled back toward Henry, dismayed and aware that he had been tricked, wondering faintly whose head Henry had seen at the end of that spring. Stan's? Victor Chris's? His father? Perhaps? Henry shrieked and rushed at Mike, the switchblade plunging up and down like the needle of a sewing machine. Gah! Nigger! Henry was screaming. Gah! Nigger! Gah! Nigger! Mike backpedaled, and the leg Henry had stabbed buckled under him, almost at once, spilling him to the floor. There was hardly any feeling at all left in that leg. It felt cold and distant. Looking down, he saw that his cream-colored slacks were now bright red. Henry's blade flashed by in front of his nose. Mike stabbed out with the Jesus Saves letter opener as Henry turned back for another go. Henry ran into it like a bug onto a pin. Warm blood doused Mike's hand. There was a snap, and when he drew his head back, he only had the half of the letter opener. The rest was sticking out of Henry's stomach. Gah! Nigger! Henry screamed, clapping a hand over the Puritan jag of blade. Blood poured through his fingers. He looked at it with bludgeon, unbelieving eyes. The head at the end of the creaking, dipping jack-in-the-box squealed and laughed. Mike, feeling sick and dizzy now, looked back at the end at it and saw Belch Huggins' head, a human champagne cork, wearing a New York Yankees baseball cap, turned backwards. He groaned aloud, and the sound was far away, echoing in his own ears. He was aware that he was sitting in a pool of warm blood. If I don't get a tourniquet on my leg, I'm going to die. Gah! Nee! Gah! Henry screamed, still bleeding, his bleeding belly with one hand and the switchblade with the other. He staggered away from Mike and toward the library doors. He wove drunkenly from side to side, progressing across the echoing main room like a pinball in an electronically game. He struck one of the easy chairs and knocked it over. His groping hand spilled a rack of newspaper onto the floor. He reached the doors and straight-armed one of them and plunged on out into the night. Mike's conditionance was fading now. He worked at the buckle of his belt with fingers he could barely feel. At last he got it unhooked and managed to pull it free of its loop. He put it around his bleeding leg just below to the groin and cinched it tight, holding it one hand. He began to crawl toward the circulation desk. The phone was there. He wasn't sure how he was going to reach it. But for now, that didn't matter. The trick was just to get there. The world wavered, blurred, grew faint behind waves of gray. He struck his tongue out, a bit down on it savagely. The pain was immediate and inquisitive. The world swung back into the focus. He became aware that he was still holding the ragged half of the letter opener, and he tossed it away. Here at last was the circulation desk, looking as tall as Everest. Mike got his good leg under him and pushed himself up, clutching at the edge of the desk with the hand that wasn't holding the belt tight. His mouth was drawn down in a trembling grimace. His eyes slintered. At last he managed to get all the way up. He stood there, short, store-like, and hooked the phone over to him. Taped to the side were free numbers, fire police, and hospital with one shaken finger that looked at least 10 miles away. Mike dialed the hospital, 555-3711. He closed his eyes as the phone began to ring, and then they opened wide as the voice of Pennywise the Clown answered. "Howdy, nigger!" Pennywise cried, and then screamed laughter as sharp as broken glass into Mike's ear. "What do you say? How do you do? I think you're dead. What do you think? I think Henry did the job on you. You want a balloon, Mikey? Want a balloon? How do you do? Hello there." Mike's eyes turned up to the face of the grandfather clock, the Mueller clock, and saw with no surprise at all that its face had been replaced by his father's face, gray and raddled with cancer. The eyes were turned up to show only bludgeon white. Suddenly his father popped his tongue out, and the clock began to strike. Mike lost his grip on the circulation desk. He swayed for a moment on his good leg, and then fell down again. The phone swung before him at the end of its cord, like a mesmerist's amulet. It was becoming very hard to hold onto the belt now. "Hello, dear Amos," Pennywise cried brightly from the swinging telephone handset. "Dis there the king's fish? I is the king's fish and dairy anyhow, and that's the truth. Wouldn't you say so, boy?" "If there's anyone there," Mike crowed, a real voice behind one I am hearing, "please help me. My name is Michael Hanlon, and I'm at the Derry Public Library. I am bleeding to death. If you're there, I can't hear you. I'm not being allowed to hear you. If you're there, please hurry." He laid on his side, drawing his legs up until he was fetal position. He took 2 turns around his right hand with the belt and considerate on holding it as the world drifted away in those cotton and balloon-like clouds of gray. "Hello, dear. How do you do?" Pennywise screamed from the dangling, swinging phone. "How do you do, you dirty coon? Hello." 4. Kanzik Street, 12:20 p.m. "Hello there," Henry Bowers said. "How do you do, little cunt?" Beverly reacted instantly, turning to run. It was a quicker reaction than any of them had expected. She might actually have gotten a running start for her hair. Henry snatched, caught part of its long flow, and pulled her back. He grinned into her feet. His breath was thick and warm and stinking. "How do you do?" Henry Bowers asked her. "Where you going? Back to play with your asshole friends? Some more? I think I'll cut off your nose and make you eat it. You like that?" She struggled to get free. Henry laughed and shook her head back and forth by the hair. The knife flashed dangerously in the hazy August sunshine. Afterly, a car horn honked a long blast. Here, here! What are you boys doing? Let that girl go!" It was an old lady behind the wheel of a well-perverted 1950 Ford. She had pulled up to the curb and was leaning across the blanket-covered seat to peer out the passenger side window. As the sight of her angry, honest face, the dazed look left Victor Chris's eyes for the first time, and he looked nervously at Henry. "What? Please," Bev cried shrilly. "He's got a knife! A knife!" The old lady's anger now became concern, surprise, and furious. "Well, what are you boys doing? Let her alone." Across the street, Bev saw this quite clearly. Herbert Ross got out of the lawn chair on this porch, approached the porch rail, and looked over. His face was as blank as Belch Huggins. He folded his paper turn and went quietly into the house. "Let her be," the old lady cried cheerily. Henry bared his teeth and suddenly ran at her car, dragging Beverly after him by the hair. She stumbled, went to one knee, was dragged. The pain in her scalp was extruded, monstrous. She felt some of her hair ripped out. The old lady screamed and cranked the passenger side window frantically. Henry stabbed down, and the switchblade skated across the glass. The woman's face came off the old Ford's clutch pedal, and it went down Kansas Street, and 3 big jerks bouncing up over the curb, where it stalled. Henry went after it, still pulling Beverly along. Victor licked his lips and looked around. Belch pushed the New York Yankees baseball cap he was wearing up on his forehead, and then dug at his ear in a puzzled gesture. Bev saw the old woman's white, frightening face for one moment, and then saw her pawing at the door locks, first on the passenger side, then on her own. The Ford's engine ground and caught. "Get out of here, you dried up old bitch!" the tires screamed as the old lady pulled back out in the street as oncoming pickup truck swerved to avoid her. Its horn blatted. Henry turned back toward Bev, beginning to smile again, and she hiked one seekered foot directly into his ball. The smile on Henry's face turned into a grimace of agony. The switchblade dropped from his hand and clattered onto the sidewalk. His other hand left its nest in place in the tangle of her hair, pulling once more, terribly as it went, and then he sank to his knees, trying to scream, holding his crouch. She could see stands of her own copper and hair in one of his hands, and in that instant all of her terror turned to bright hate. She drew in a great hitching breath and hawked a remarkable large loony onto the top of his head. Then she turned and ran. Belch lumbered 3 steps after her and stopped. He and Victor went to Henry, who threw them aside and staggered to his feet, both hands still cupping his balls. It was not the first time that summer that he had been kicked there. He leaned over and picked up the switchblade on. He wheezed. "What, Henry?" Belch said anxiously. Henry turned a face toward him that was so full of sweaty pain and sick blazing hate that Belch fell back a step. "I said, come on." He managed and began to stagger and lurched up the street after Beverly, holding his crouch. "We can't catch her now, Henry," Victor said uneasily. "Hell, you can hardly walk." "We'll catch her," Henry panted. His upper lip was rising and falling in an unconscious dog-like sneer. Beads of sweat stood out on his forehead and ran down his headache cheeks. "We'll catch her, all right, because I know where she's going. She's going down to the Barrens to be with her asshole." 5. The Derry Townhouse, 2 a.m. "Asshole friends," Beverly said. Bill looked at her. His thoughts had been far away. They had been walking hand to hand, the silence between them, contemptibility and slightly charged with mutable reactions. He had caught only the last word of what she had said. A block ahead, the lights of the townhouse shone through the low ground fog. "I said you were my best friend, the only friends I've ever had back then," she smiled. "Making friends has never been any strong suit, I guess, although I've got a good one back in Chicago. A woman named Kay McCall. I think you like her, Bill." "Probably would. I've never been real fast to make friends myself." He smiled. Back then, we were all we needed, he saw. Beads of moisture in her hair. Appreciated the way the lights made a nimbus around her head. Her eyes were turned gravely up to his. "I need something now," she said. "What's that?" "I need you to kiss me," she said. He thought of Audrey, and for the first time it occurred to him that she looked like Beverly. He wondered if maybe that had been the attraction all along, the reason he had been able to find guts enough to ask Audrey out near the end of the Hollywood party where they had met. He felt a pang of unhappy guilt, and then he took Beverly, his childhood friend, in his arm. Her kiss was firm and warm and sweet. Her brushes pushed against his open coat, and her hips moved against him, away, and then against him again. Then her hips moved away a second time. He plunged both of his hands into her hair and moved against her. When she felt him grow in hard, she uttered a little gasp and put her face against the side of his neck. He felt her tears on his skin, warm and secret. "Come on," she said, "quick." He took her hand, and they walked the rest of the way to the townhouse. The lobby was old, festooned with plants, and still possessed of a fading charm. The decor was never very much 19th century lumberman. It was deserted as this hour, except for the desk clerk, who would be dimly seen in the inner office, his feet cocked up on the desk, watching TV. Bill pushed the third floor button with a finger that trembled just slightly. Excitement, nervous, guilt, all of the above? Oh yeah, sure, and a kind of almost insane joy. And fear as well. These feelings did not mix peacefully, but they seemed necessary. He led her down the hallway toward his room, decided in some confused way that if he were to be unfaithful, it should be a complete act of indefinitely consuming it in his place, and not hers. He found himself thinking of Susan Bowens, his first book agent, and when he was not quite 20, his first lover. Cheating on my wife. He tried to get this through his head, but it seemed both real and unreal at the same time. What seemed the strongest was an unhappy sense of homesickness, an old-fashioned feeling of wailing away. Audrey would be up by now, making coffee, sitting at the kitchen table in her row, perhaps studying lines, perhaps reading a Dick Francis novel. His keys rattled in the lock of room 311. If they had gone to Beverly's room on the 5th floor, they would have seen the message light on her phone, blinking the TV, watching desk clerk. Would have given her a message to call her friend, Kay, in Chicago. After Kay's third frantic call, he had finally remembered to post the message. Things might have taken a different course. The 5 of them might not have been fugitive from the Derry police when that day light finally broke, but they went to his, as things had perhaps been arranged. The door opened. They were inside. She looked at him, eyes bright, cheeks flushed, her breast rising and falling rapidly. He took her in his arms and was overwhelmed by the feeling of rightness, the feeling of the circle between past and present, closing with a trumpet and seamless. He kicked the door shut clumsily with one foot, and she laughed her warm breath into his mouth. "My heart," she said, and put his hand on her left breast. He could feel it below, that firm, almost maddened softness, racing like an engine. "Your heart, my heart." They were on the bed, still dressed, kissing. Her hand slipped inside his shirt, then out again. She traced a finger down the row of buttons, paused at his waist, and then that same finger slipped lower, tracing down the stony thickness of his cock muscles. He hadn't been aware of jumping and fluttered in his groan. He broke the kiss and moved his body away from hers on the bed. "Bill, got to stop up for a minute," he said, "or else I'm going to shoot in my pants like a kid." She laughed again softly and looked at him. "Is it that, or are you having second thoughts?" "Second thoughts," Bill said. I always have those." "I don't. I hate him," she said. He looked at her. The smile faded. "It didn't know it all the way to the top of my mind until 2 nights ago," she said. "Oh, I knew it somewhere all along, I guess. He hits and he hurts. I married him because my father always worried about me. I guess no matter how hard I tried, he worried. And I guess I knew he'd approve of Tom because Tom always worried too. He worried a lot. And as long as someone was worrying about me, I'd be safe, more than safe. Real." She looked at him solemnly. Her blouse had pulled out of a waistband of her slacks, revealing a white stripe of stomach. He waited to kiss it, but it wasn't real. It was a nightmare. Being married to Tom was like going back into that nightmare. Why would a person do that, Bill? Why would a person go back into the nightmare of her own accord? Bill said. The only reason I can figure is that people go back to find themselves. The nightmare's here, Bev said. The nightmare is Dairy Tom. Looks like small corp compared to that. I can see better now. I loathed myself for the years I spent with him. You don't know the things he made me do, and oh, I was happy enough to do them, because he worried about me. I'd cried, but sometimes there's too much shame. Don't, he said quietly, and put his hand over hers. She held it tightly. Her eyes were overbright, but the tears didn't fall. Everybody goofs it, but it's not an exam. You just go through it the best you can. What I mean, she said, is that I'm not cheating on Tom or trying to use you to get my own back on him or anything like that. For me, it would be like something sane and normal and sweet. But I don't want to hurt you, Bill, or trick you into something you'll be sorry for later. He thought about this. Thought about it with a real and deep serious, but the odd little mimickin, he thrust his fists, and so on began to circle back, breaking into his thoughts. It had been a long day. Mike's call and the invitation to lunch at Jade of the Oraton seemed 100 years ago. So many stories since then, so many memories like photographs from George's album. Friends don't trick each other, he said, and leaned toward her on the bed. Their lips touched, and he began to unbutton her blouse. One of her hands went to the back of his neck and held him closer while the other first unzipped her slacks and then pushed them down. For a moment his hand was on her stomach, warm than her panties were gone in a whisper. Then he nudged, and she guided. As he entered her, she arched her back gently toward the thrust of his sex and muttered, "Be my friend. I love you, Bill." "I love you too," he said, smiling against her bare shoulder. They began slowly, and he felt sweat begin to flow out of his skin as they quickened beneath him. His consciousness began to drain downward, becoming focused more and more strongly on their connection. Her pores had opened, releasing a loving, musky odor. Beverly felt her climax coming. She moved toward it, working for it, never doubting it would come. Her body suddenly stuttered and seemed to keep upward, not orgasms in, but reaching a plateau far above any she had reached with Tom or the two lovers she had had before. Tom, she became aware that this wasn't going to be just a come. It was going to be a tactical nuke. She began a little afraid, but her body picked up the rhythm again. She felt Bill's long leg stiffen against her, his whole body suddenly become as hard as the part of him, inside herself. And at that same moment she began to climax. Pleasure so great it was nearly agony spilled out of her unsuspected food gates, and she bit down on his shoulder to stifle her cries. "Oh my God," Bill gasped, and although she was never sure later, she believed he was crying. He pulled back, and she thought he was going to withdraw from her. She tried to prepare for that moment, which always brought a fleeting, unexpected sense of loss and emphasis, something like a footprint. And then he thrust forward strongly again. Right away, she had a second orgasm, something she hadn't known was possible for her. And the window of memories opened again, and she saw birds, thousands of birds, descended onto every roof peak and telephone line and RFD mailbox and dairy spring birds against a white April sky. And there was pain mixed with pleasure, but mostly it was long, as a white spring sky seems low physical pain mixed with low physical pleasure and some crazy sense of aspiration. She had bled. She had all of you, she cried suddenly, her eyes wide and stunned. He did pull back and out of her this time, but in the sudden shock of the relations, she barely felt him go. "What, Beverly, are you all of you? I made love to all of you?" She saw shocked surprise on Bill's face, the drop of his jaw, and sudden understand. But it was not her religions, even in her own. Shocked, she saw that it was his own. Bill, wasn't it? That was your way to get us out," he said. And now his eyes blazed so brightly, they frightened her. "Beverly, don't you understand? That was your way to get us out. But we were. Suddenly he looked frightened, unsure. Do you remember the rest now, she asked. He shook his head slowly. Not the specifics, but he looked at her, and she saw he was badly frightened. What it really came down to was we wished our way out, and I'm not sure, Beverly. I'm not sure that grown-ups can do that. She looked at him without speaking for a long moment, then sat on the edge of the bed, with no particular self-consciousness. Her body was smooth and lovely, the line of her backbone barely discernible in the distance as she bent to take off the knee-high nunlin stockings she had been wearing. Her hair was a sheaf, coiled over one shoulder. He thought he would want her again before morning, and that feeling of guilt came again, tempered only by the shameful comfort of knowing that Audrey was an ocean away. Put another nickel in the jukebox, he thought. This tune is called What She Don't Know Won't Hurt Her, but it hurts somewhere in the spaces between people. Maybe. Beverly got up and turned the bed down. Come to bed. We need sleep, both of us. All right, because that was right. That was a big 10-4. More than anything else, he wanted to sleep, but not tonight. The latest shock was wearing off too quickly, perhaps, but he felt so tired now, so used to it. Second to second, reality had the quality of a dream, and in spite of his guilt, he felt that this was a safe place. It would be possible to lie here for a little while, to sleep in her arms. He wanted her warmth and her friendliness. Both were sexually charged, but that could hurt neither of them now. He stripped off his socks and shirt and got in next to her. She pressed against him, her breasts warm, her long legs cool. Bill held her, aware of the differences. Her body was longer than Audrey's and fuller at the breast and the hip. But it was a welcome body. It should have been with you, dear, he thought drowsily. I think that was the way it was really supposed to be. Why wasn't it, Ben? But because it was you then, and it's you now. That's all because what goes around always comes around. I think Bob Dylan said that, or maybe it was Ronald Reagan, and maybe it's me now, because Ben's the one who's supposed to see the lady home. Beverly wrinkled against him, not in a sexual way, although even as he fled towards sleep, she felt him stir again against her leg and was glad, but only wanting his warmth. She was already half asleep herself. Her happiness here with him, after all these years, was real. She knew that because of its bitter undertaste there was tonight, and perhaps there would be another time for them tomorrow morning. Then they would go down in the sewers, as they had before, and they would find there the circle would close every tighter. Their present lives would emerge smoothly with their own childhood. They would become like creatures on some crazy Methodist street. Either that, or they would die down there. She turned over. He slipped an arm between her side and her arm and cupped one breast gently. She did not have to lie awake, wondering if the hand suddenly clamped down in a hard pitch. Her thoughts began to break up as sleep slid into her. As always, she saw a brilliant wildflower patterns as she crossed over Masson of them nodding brightly under a blue sky. These faded, and there was a fallen censorish, the sort of censors that had sometimes snapped her awake and sweating as a child, a scream on the other side of her face. Childhood dreams of fallen she had read in her college Pacifical text were common, but she didn't snap back this time. She could feel the warm and comforting weight of Bill's arm, his hand cradling her breast. She thought that if she was fallen, at least she wasn't fallen alone. Then she touched down and was running. This dream, whenever it was, moved fast. She ran after it, pursuing sleep, silence, maybe just time. The years moved fast. The years ran. If you turned around and ran after your own child, you had to really let out your stride and burst your buns. 29, the year she had streaked her hair Faster, 22, the year she had fallen in love with a football player named Greg Mallory, who had damn near raped her after a Fatcherin party. Faster, 16, getting drunk with two of her girlfriends on the Bluebird hill overlooking Portland. 14, 12. Faster, faster, faster. She ran into sleep, chasing 12, catching it, running through the barrier of memory that it had cast over all of them. It tasted like cold fog in her labor and dream lungs, running back into her 11th year, running like hell, running to beat the devil. Looking back now. Looking back. 6. The Barriers, 12:40 p.m. Over her shoulder, for any sign of them, as she slipped and scrambled her way down the embankment. No sign, at least not yet. She had really fetched it to him, as her father sometimes said, and just thinking of her father brought another wave of guilt and despondence washing over her. She looked under the ricketed bridge, hoping to see Silver heeled over on his side, but Silver was gone. There was a catch of toy guns, which they no longer bothered to take home, and that was all. She started down the path, looked back, and there they were. Belch and Victor supported Henry between them, standing on the edge of the embankment like Indian sentries in a Randolph Scott movie. Henry was horribly pale. He pointed at her. Victor and Belch began to help him down to slope dirt and gravel spilled from beneath their heels. Beverly looked at them for a long moment, almost hypnotized. Then she turned and sprinted through the trickle of brook water that ran out from under the bridge, ignoring Ben's steps in stones, her sneakers spraying out flat sheets of water. She ran down the path, the breath hot in her throat. She could feel the muscles in her legs trembling. She didn't have much left now. The clubhouse, if she could get there, she might still be safe. She ran along the path, branching, whipping even more color into her cheeks, one strike in her eye, and making it water. She cut to the right, blundered through tangles of underbush, and came out into the clearing. Both the camouflage doors and the slit window stood open. Rock and roll drifted up. At the sounds of her approach, Ben Hanscom's popped up. He had a box of Junior Mints in one hand and an Archon comic book in the other. He got a look at Bev, and his mouth fell open. Under circumstances, it would have been almost funny. Bev, what the hell? She didn't bother replying. Behind her, and not too far behind either, she could hear branches snapping and whipping. There was a muffled, shouted curse. It sounded as if Henry was getting livelier, so she just ran at the square trapdoor, opening, her hair tangled now with green leaves and twigs, as well as the crud from her scrambled under the garage truck, streaming behind her. Ben saw she was coming in like the 101st Airborne and disappeared as quickly as he had come out. Beverly jumped, and he caught her clumsily. Shut everything, she panted. Hurry up, Ben, for heaven's sake. They're coming. Who? Henry and his friends. Henry's gone crazy. He's got a knife. There was enough for Ben. He dropped his Junior Mints and Funderuk. He pulled the trapdoor shut with a grunt. The top was covered with sods. The tangled track was still holding them. Remarkable well. A few blocks of sod had gotten loose, but that was all. Beverly stood on tiptoe and closed the window. They were in darkness. She felt for Ben, found him, and hugged him with panic tightness. After a moment, he hugged her back. They were both on their knees. With sudden horror, Beverly realized that Richie's transmitter and radio were still playing somewhere in the blackness. Little Richard singing The Girl Can't Help It. Ben, the radio, they'll hear. Oh, God. He bunted her with one meaty hip and almost knocked her sprawling in the dark. She heard the radio falling to the floor. The Girl Can't Help It. The men folks stopped and stared. Little Richard informed them with his custom and hoarse enthusiasm. Can't help it. The backup group testified. The girl can't help it. Ben was panting now, too. They sounded like a couple of steam engines. Suddenly, there was a crunch and silence. Oh, shit, Ben said. I just squashed it. Richie's going to have a bird. He reached for her in the darkness. She felt his hand touch one of her breasts, then jerked away as if burned. She groped for him, got hold of his shirt, and he drew him close. Beverly, what? Shh, he quieted. They sat together, arms around each other, looking up. The darkness was not quite perfect. There was a narrow line of light down one side of the trapdoor, and three other outlines. The slit window, one of these three, was wide enough to let a slanted ray of sunlight fall into the clubhouse. She could only pray they wouldn't see it. She could hear them approaching at first. She couldn't make out the words, and then she could. Her grip on Ben tightened. If she went into the bamboo, we can pick up her trail easy. Victor was saying, they play around here, Henry replied. His voice was strained, his words emerging in little puffs, as if with great effort. Boogers, Towlindo said so. And the day we had that rock fight, they were coming from here. Yeah, they played guns and stuff, Belch said. Suddenly, they were funding footballs right above them. The sod-covered cap vibrated up and down. Dirt scintillated onto Beverly's upturned face. One, two, maybe even all three of them were standing on top of the clubhouse. A cramped lance to her belly. She had to bite down against the cry. Ben put one big hand on the side of her face and pressed it against his arm as he looked up, waiting to see if they would guess, or if they knew already and were just playing games. We got a place, Henry was saying. That's what Boogers told me. Some kind of a treehouse or something. They called it their club. I'll call 'em if they want a club, Victor said. Belch uttered a thunderous hee-haw of laughter at this. Thump, thump, thump overhead. The cat moved up and down a little more this time. Surely they would notice it. Ordinary ground. Just didn't have that kind of give. Let's look down by the river, Henry said. I bet she's down there. Okay, Victor said. Thump, thump. They were moving off. Bev let a little sigh. A relief trickle through her clamped teeth. And then Henry said, You stay here and guard the path, Belch. Okay, Belch said, and he began to march back and forth, sometimes leaving the cap, sometimes coming back across it. More dirt sifted down. Ben and Beverly looked at each other with strained, dirty faces. Bev became aware that there was more than the smell of smoke in the clubhouse. A sweaty garbage and stank was rising as well. That's me, she thought. Dismillion, in spite of the smell. She hugged Ben even tighter. His bulk seemed suddenly very welcome, very comforting. She was glad there was a lot of him to hug. He might have been nothing but a frightened and fat boy when school let out for the summer, but he was more than that now. Like all of them, he had changed. If Belch discovered them down here, Ben just might give him a surprise. I'll club him if they want a club, Belch said, and chuckled. A Belch-Huggins chuckle was a low, troll-like sound. Club him if they want a club. That's good. That's pretty much okie dokie. She became aware that Ben's upper body was heaving up and down in short, sharp movements. He was pulling air into his lungs and letting it out in little bursts. For one alarmed moment, she thought he was starting to cry, and then she got a closer look at his face, and realizing he was struggling against laughter, his eyes leaking tears. Laughter's rolled madly and looked away in the faint light which struggled in through the cracks around the closed trapdoor in the window. She could see his face was nearly purple with the stain of holding it in. Club him if they want an old chubby-dubby, Belch said, and sat down heavily right in the center of the cab. This time the roof trembled more alarmedly, and Bev heard a low but ominous crack from one of the supports. The cap had been meant to support the chunks of camouflage and sod laid on top of it, but not the added 160 pounds of Belch-Huggins' weight. If he doesn't get up, he's going to land in our lap, Bev thought, and she began to catch Ben's hystridion. It was trying to boil out of her and rank its whoops and brays in her mind's eyes. She suddenly saw herself pushing the window up enough on its hinges for her hand to creep out, and it missed her a really good goose to belch Huggins' backside as he sat there in the hazy afternoon sun, muttering and giggling. She buried her face against Ben's chest in the last-ditch effort to keep it inside. Shh, Ben whispered. For Christ's sake, Bev. Crack. Louder this time. Will it hold? She whispered back. It might, if he doesn't fart, Ben said. And a moment later, Belch did cut one a loud and fruity trumpet blast that seemed to go on for at least 3 seconds. They held each other even tighter, muffling each other's frantic giggles. Beverly's head hurt so badly that she thought she might soon have a stroke. Then, faintly, she heard Henry yelling Belch's name. What? Belch bellowed, getting up with a thump and a thud that sifted more dirt down on Ben and Beverly. What, Henry? Henry yelled something back. Beverly couldn't only make out the words, bank and bushes. Okay, Belch bawled, and his feet crossed the cap for the last time. There was a final cracking noise, this one much louder, and a splinter of wood landed in Bev's lap. She picked it up, wondering in 5 more minutes. Ben said in a low whisper, That's all it would have taken. Did you hear him when he let go? Beverly asked, beginning to giggle again. Sounded like World War III, Ben said, also beginning to laugh. It was a relief to be able to let it out, and they laughed wildly, trying to do it in whispers, finally unaware she was going to say at all, and certainly not because it had any discernible bearing on the situation. Beverly said, Thank you for the poem, Ben. Ben stopped laughing all at once and regarded her gravely, cautiously. He took a dirt handkerchief from his back pocket and wiped his face with a slowly. Poem? The haiku on the postcard. You sent it, didn't you? No, Ben said. I didn't send you any haiku. Because if a fat kid like me, did something like that, the girl would probably laugh at him. I didn't laugh. I thought it was beautiful. I could never write anything beautiful, Bill. Bill maybe, not me. Bill will write, she agreed, but he'll never write anything as nice as that. May I use your handkerchief? He gave it to her, and she began to clean her face as best she could. How did you know it was me? He asked, finally. I don't know, she said. I just did. Ben's throat worked confusedly. He looked down at his hands. I didn't mean anything by it. She looked at him gravely. You better not mean that, she said. If you do, it's really going to spoil my day, and I'll tell you, it's going downhill already. He continued to look down at his hands and spoke at last in a voice she could barely hear. Well, I mean, I love you, Beverly, but I don't want to spoil anything. It won't, she said, and hugged him. I need all the love I can get right now. But you especially like Bill? Maybe I do, she said, but that doesn't matter. If we were grown-ups, maybe it would, a little, but I like you all suspiciously. You're the only friends I have. I love you too, Ben. Thank you, he said. He paused, trying, and brought it out. He was able to look at her as he said it. I wrote the poem. They sat without saying anything for a while. Beverly felt safe, protected. The images of her father's face and Henry's knife seemed less vivid and threatening when they sat close like this. That sense of protection was hard to define, and she didn't try, although much later she would recognize the source of its strength. She was in the arms of a male who would die for her with no hesitation at all. It was a fact that she simply knew it was in a sense that came from the pores, something utterly prevented and that her own glands could respond to. The others were coming back, Ben said suddenly. What if they get caught out? She straightened up, aware that she had almost been dozing. Bill, she remembered, had invited Mike Hanlon home to lunch with him. Richie was going to go home, would stand and have sandwiches, and Eddie had promised to bring back his passionate board. They would be arriving soon, totally unaware that Henry and his friends were in the Barriers. We got to get to get to them, Beverly said. Henry's not just after me. If we come out and then come back, yes, but at least we know they're here. Bill and the other guys don't. Eddie can't even run. They already broke his arm. Cheese and crone, Ben said. I guess we'll have to chance it. Yeah, she swallowed and looked at her Timex. It was hard to read in the dimness, but she thought it was a little past one. Ben. What? Henry's really gone crazy. He's like that kid in the blackboard jungle. He was going to kill me, and the other two were going to help him. Oh, no, Ben said. Henry's crazy, but not that crazy. He's just what? Beverly said. She thought of Henry and Patrick in the automobile graveyard, in the fixed sunshine. Henry's blank eyes. Ben didn't answer. He was thinking. Things had changed, hadn't they? When you were inside the charge changes, they were harder to see. You had to step back to see them. You had to try anyway. When school let out, he'd be afraid of Henry, but only because Henry was bigger and because he was a bully, the kind of kid who would grab a first grader, Indian rub his arm, and send him away crying. That was about all. Then he had engraved Ben's belly. There had been the rock fight, and Henry had been chucking M80s at people's heads. You could kill somebody with one of those things. You could kill somebody easy. He had started to look different, haunted, almost. It seemed that you always had to be on the watch for him, the way you'd always have to be on watch for tigers or poisonous snakes if you were in the jungle. But you got used to it, so used to it that it didn't even seem unusual, just the way things were. But Henry was crazy, wasn't he? Yes, Ben had known on the day school ended and willfully refused to believe it or remember it. It wasn't the kind of thing you wanted to believe or remember, and suddenly a thought so strong it was almost a certain crept into his mind full-blown, as cold as October mud. It's using Henry, maybe the others too, but it's using them, though, Henry, and if that's the truth, then she's probably right. It's not just Indian rubs or rabbit punches in the back of the neck during study time near the end of the school day while Mrs. Douglas reads her book at her desk, not just a push on the playground so that you fall down and skin your knee. If it's using him, then Henry will use the knife. An old lady saw them trying to beat him up, Beverly was saying. Henry went after her. He kicked her tail light out. This alarmed Ben more than anything else. He understood instantly, as most kids did, that they lived below the sight lines and Hesses, the thought lines of most adults when a grown-up was dirty bopping down the street, thinking the grown-ups' thoughts about work and appointments and buying cars and whatever else grown-ups thought about. He never noticed kids playing hopscotch or guns or kick the can or ring-a-levia or hide-and-go-seek. Bullies like Henry could get away with hurting other kids quite a lot if they were careful to stay below that sight line. At the very most, a passing adult was apt to say something like, "Why don't you quit that?" and then just continue dirty bopping along without waiting to see if the bully stopped or not. So the bully would wait until the grown-up had turned the corner and then go back to business as usual. It was like adults thought that real life only started when a person was 5 feet tall. If Henry had gone after some old lady, he had gone above that sight line, and that more than anything else suggesting to Ben that he was crazy. Beverly saw the relief in Ben's face and felt relief sweep over her. She would not have to tell him about how Mr. Ross had simply folded his paper and walked into his house. She didn't want to tell him about it, that it was too scary. "Let's go up to Kensett Street," Ben said, and apparently pushed open the trapdoor. "Get ready to run." He stood up in the opening and looked around. The clearing was silent. He could hear the chuckling voice of the Kennebec, close-by bird songs, the dum of a diesel engine sorting its way into the train yard. He heard something else and that made him uneasy. He would have felt much better if he'd heard Henry, Victor, and Belch cursing their way through the heavy undergrowth down by the stream, but he couldn't hear them at all. "Come on," he said, and helped Beverly up. She also looked around uneasily, brushing her hair back with her hands and grimacing at its greasy feel. It took her hand, and they pushed through a screen of bushes toward Kansas Street. "We'd better stay off the path." "No," she said. "We've got to hurry." He nodded. "All right." They got to the path and started towards Kansas Street when she stumbled over a rock in the path. And 7. The cemetery grounds. 2:17 a.m. Fell heavily on the moon-silvered sidewalk. A grunt was forced out of him, and a runner of blood came with the grunt, splattered onto the cracked concern. In the moonlight, it looked as black as beetle blood. Henry looked at it for a long, dazed moment. They raised his head to look around. Kansas Street was early morning, silent. The houses shut up and dark except for a scatter of night lights. Here was a sewer grate. A balloon with a smiley smile face was tied to one of its iron bars. The balloon bopped and dripped into the faint breeze. Henry got to his feet again, one sticky hand pressed to his belly. The nigger had stuffed him pretty good, but Henry gone him one better. Yes, sir. As far as the nigger was concerned, Henry felt like he was pretty much okie dokie. "Kid's a gone goose," Henry muttered, and made a shaky straggling way past the floating balloon. Fresh blood glimmered on his hand as it continued to flow from his stomach. "Kid's all done. Grease the sucker. Gonna grease them all. Teach them to throw rocks." The world was coming in slow, rolling waves. His big cobras, like the ones they used to show at the beginning of every Hawaiian Five-O episode on the One TV. Bookum Dono. Ha, Jack fucking Lord, okay. Jack fucking Lord was pretty much okie dokie. And Henry could almost hear the sound those all-wind big boys make as they rise, curl, and shake. Shakes. The reality of the world. Pipeline, Kansas. Remember Pipeline. Pipeline was pretty much okie dokie. Wipe out. Crazy laugh there at the start. Sounded like Patrick Hawkscutter. Fucking queer boy. Got greased himself. And as far as he was concerned, that was fuck of a lot better than okie dokie. That was just fine. That was just as fine as paint. Okay, Pipeline, shoot the line. Don't back down. On my boys, catch a wave and shoot. A wave and go sidewalk surfing with me. Shoot the line. Shoot the world, but keep an ear inside his head. It kept hearing that kaspang sound, an eye inside his head. It kept seeing Victor's head rising on the end of that spring, eyelids and cheeks and forehead cartoon tattoos with roses of blood. Henry looked barely to his left and saw that the houses had been replaced with a tall black stand of hedge. Looming above it was narrow, gloomily Victorian pile of the theological seminary. Not a window shone light. The seminary had graduated its last class in June of 1974. It had closed its doors that summer, and now whatever walked alone, and only by permission of the Chattering Women's Club that called itself the Derry Horizontal Society. It came to the walk which led up to the front door. It was barred by a heavy chain from which a metal sign hung, "No trespass in this order," enforced by Derry police permanent. Henry's feet tangled on his track, and he fell heavily again, whacked to the sidewalk. Up ahead, a car turned it onto Kansas Street. From Hawthorne, its headlights washed down the street. Henry fought the dazzle long enough to see the lights on top. It was a Fuzz Mobile. He crawled under the chain and crabbed his way to the left, so he was behind the hedge. The night drew on his hot face was wonderful. He lay face down, turning his head from side to side, wetting his cheeks, drinking what he could drink. The police car floating by without slowing. Then suddenly its bubbles lights came on, washing the darkness with an erratic blue pulse. of light. There was no need for the siren on the deserted streets, but Henry heard its mill suddenly crank up to full revs. Rubber, blistering, a startled scream from the pavement. Caught! I'm caught, his mind glibbered, and then he realized that the police car was heading away from him, up Kansas Street. A moment later, a hellish warbling sound filled the night, heading towards him from the south. He imagined some huge silky black cat loping through the dark, all green and flecks and pelt, it in a new shape coming for him, coming to gobble him up. Little by little, and only as the warbling began to veer away, he realized it was an ambulance headed in the direction the Fuzzmobile had gone. He laid stuttering on the wet grass, too cold now, struggling. Fuzz it cousin, buzz it cousin, rockin' and roll. And we got chicken in the barn. What barn? Whose barn? My. Not to vomit. He was afraid that if he vomited, all of his guts could come up. And there were 5 of them still to get. Ambulance and police cars. Where are they heading? The library, of course. The nigger. But they're too late. I greased him. Might as well turn off your siren, boys. He ain't gonna hear it. He's just as dead as a fence post. But was he? Henry licked his peeling lips with his arrayed tongue. If he was dead, there would be no warbling siren in the night. Not unless the nigger had called them. So maybe, just maybe, the nigger wasn't dead. No, Henry breathed. He rolled over on his back and stared it up at the sky, at the billions of stars up there. It had come from there. He knew, from somewhere up in that sky. It came from outer space with a lust for earthworm, came to robe all the women and raped all the men. Say, Frank, don't you mean rob all the men and rape all the women? Waff running this show? Phil and man, you or Jesse? Victor used to tell that one, and that was pretty much came from the spaces between the stars, looking up at the starry sky. It gave him the creeps. It was too big, too black. It was all too possible to imagine it turning blood red. All too possible to imagine a face forming in lines of fire. He closed his eyes, shivering and holding his arms crossed on his belly, and he fought. The nigger is dead. Someone heard us fighting and sent the cops to investigate, that's all. Then why the ambulance? Shut up, Henry groaned. He felt the old blast rage again. He remembered how they had beaten him again and again in the old days that seemed so close and so vital now. How every time he believed he had them, they had somehow slipped through his fingers. It had been like on the day after Belch saw Coos running down Kansas Street toward the barriers. He remembered that. Oh yes, he remembered that clearly enough. When you got kicked in the balls, you remembered it. It had happened to him again, and again that summer. Henry struggled to a sitting position, wincing at the deep dagger of pain in his guts. Victor and Belch had helped him down into the barrens. He had walked as fast as he could, in spite of the agony that gripped and pulled at his groin and the root of his belly. The time had come to finish it. They had followed the path to a clearing from which 5 or 6 paths radiated like strands of a spider web. Yes, there had been kids playing around here. You didn't have to be Tonto to see that. There were scraps of candy wrapper, the curled tail of a shot-off roll of bang caps, red and black, a few boards, and a fluffy scatter of sawdust, as if something had been built there. He remembered standing in the center of the clearing and scanning the trees, looking for their baby treehouse. He would spot it, and then he would climb up, and the girl would be cowering there, and he would use the knife to cut her throat and feel her titties nice and easy until they stopped moving. But he didn't been able to see any treehouse. Neither had Belch or Victor. The old familiar frustration rose in his throat. He and Victor left Belch to guard the clearing while they went down the river, but there had been no sign for her there either. He remembered bending over and picking up a rock. And 8. The Barriers, 12:55 p.m. Having it far down the streams, furious and bewildered. Where the fuck did she go? He demanded, wheeling toward Victor. Victor shook his head slowly. Don't know, he said. You're bleeding. Henry looked down and saw a dark spot the size of a quarter on the crotch of his jeans. The pain had withdrawn to a low throbbing ache, but his underpants felt too small and too tight. His balls were swollen. He felt that anger inside him again, something like a knotted rope around his heart. She had done this. Where's she? He hissed at Victor. Don't know, Victor said again in that same dual voice. He seemed hypnotized, sunstruck, now really there at all. Ran away, I guess. She could be all the way over to the old Camptown Cape by now. She's not, Henry said. She's hiding. They've got a place and she's hiding there. Maybe it's not a tree house. Maybe it's something else. What? I don't know, Henry shouted, and Victor flinched back. Henry stood in the Kanzuk, the cold water boiling over the tops of the sneakers, looking around, his eyes fixed on a cylinder poking out of the embankment, about 20 feet down a stream, a pumping station. He climbed out of the water and walked down to it, feeling a sort of necessary dread settle into him. His skin seemed to be tightened and his eyes widened so that they were able to see more and more. It seemed he could feel the tiny hairs in his ears stirring and moving like kelp in an underwater tidal flow. Low humming came from the pumping station, and beyond it, he could see a pipe jutting out of the embankment over the Kanzuk, and steady flow of sludge pulsed out of the pipe and ran into the water. He turned over the cylinder's round iron top. Henry, Victor called nervously. Henry, what are you doing? Henry paid no attention. He put his eyes to one of the round holes in the iron and saw nothing but blackness. He exchanged eye for ear. Wait. The voice drifted up to him from the blackness inside, and Henry felt his interior temperature plummet to 0, his veins and arteries freezing into crystal tubes of ice. But with tense sensation came an almost unknown, feeling loved. His eyes widened, a clownish smile spread his lips in a large, nervously arch. It was the voice from the moon. Now it was down in the pumping station, down in the drains. Wait, watch. He waited, but there was no more, only the steady Sorpican drone of the pumping machinery. He walked back down to where Victor stood on the bank, watching him cautioningly. Henry ignored him and hollered for Belch. In a little while, Belch came. Come on, he said. What are we going to do, Henry? Belch asked. Wait, watch. They crept back toward the clearing and sat down. Henry tried to pull his underpants away from his aching balls, but it hurt too much. Henry, what? Belch began. Shh. Belch fell obstinately silent. Henry had camels, but he didn't share them out. He didn't want the bitch to smell cigarette smoke if she was around. He could have explained, but there was no need. The voice had spoken only 2 words to him, but these seemed to explain everything. They played down here. Soon the others would come back. Why settle for just a bitch when they could have all 7 of the little shifty pokes? They waited and watched. Victor and Belch seemed to have gone to sleep with their eyes open. It was not a long wait, but there was time for Henry to think of a good many things now he had found. The switchblade this morning, for instance. It wasn't the same one he'd had on a last day of school. He'd lost that one somewhere. This one looked a lot cooler. It came in the mail, sort of. He had stood on the porch, looking at the battered, leaning RFD box, trying to grasp what he was seeing. The box was decked with balloons. 2 were tied to the metal hook where the postmen sometimes hung packages. Others were tied to the flags, red, yellow, blue, green. It was as if some weird circus had crept by a witchman road in the dead of night, leaving this sign. As he approached the mailbox, he saw there were faces on the balloons, the faces of the kids who disbelieved him all this summer, the kids who seemed to mock him at every turn. He had stared at these apparitions gape-mouthed, and then the balloons popped one by one. That had been good. It was if he were making them pop just by thinking about it, killing them with his mind. The front of the mailbox suddenly swung open. Henry walked toward it and peered in, although the mailman didn't get this far out until the middle of the afternoon. Henry felt no surprise when he saw a flat, rectangular package inside. He pulled it out. Mr. Henry Bowers, RFD number 2. Derry, Maine. The address read, there was an evening a return and address of sorts, Mr. Robert Gray, Derry, Maine. He opened the package, letting the brown paper drift down heedlessly by his feet. There was a white box inside. He opened it. Lying on the bed of white cotton had been the Swiss knife. He took it out the house. His father was lying on his pallet in the bedrooms they shared, surrounded by empty beer cans. His belly plunged over the top of his yellow underpants. Henry knelt beside him, listening to the sort and fluttered of his father's breathing, watching his father's hoarsened lips and person puckered with each breathe. Henry placed the business end of the switch knife against his father's scrawny neck. His father moved a little and then settled back into Barry sleep again. Henry kept the knife like that for almost 5 minutes, his eyes distant and thoughtful, the ball of his left thumb careless, the silver button set into the switchblade's neck. The voice from the moon spoke to him. It whispered like the spring wind, which is warm, with a cold blade buried somewhere in its middle. It buzzed like a paper nest full of roused hornets. It huckstered like a horse politic. Everything the voice said seemed pretty much okie dokie to Henry, and so he pushed the silver button. There was a click inside the knife as the suicide spring let go, and 6 inches of steel drove through Butch's Bower's neck. It went in easily as tines of a meat fork into the breast of a well-roasted chicken. The tip of the blade popped out on the other side, dripping. Butch's eyes flew open. He stared at the ceiling. His mouth dropped open. Blood ran from the corners of it and down his cheeks toward the lobes of his ears. He began to gurgle. A large blood bubbled formed between his slack lips and popped. One of his hands crept to Henry's knees and squeezed conventionally. Henry didn't mind. Presently, the hand fell away. The gurgling noise stopped a moment later. Butch Bowers was dead. Henry pulled the knife out, wiped it on the dirty sheet that covered his father's pallet, and pushed the blade back in until the spring clicked. He looked at his father without much interest. The voice had told him about the day's work while he knelt beside Butch with the knife against Butch's neck. The voice had explained everything, so he went into the other room to call Belch and Victor. Now here they were, all three, and although his balls still ached horribly, the knife made a comfort and bludge in his left front pants pocket. He felt that the cutting would begin soon. The others would come back down to resume whatever baby game they had been playing, and then the cutting would begin. The voice from the moon had laid it out for him. As he knelt by his father and on his way into town, he had been unable to take his eyes from that pale ghostess in the sky. He saw that there was indeed a man in the moon, a grisly, glimmering ghost face with created holes for eyes of a glamorous grin that seemed to reach halfway up its cheekbones. It talked. "We float down here, Henry. We all float. You'll float too. All the way to town. Kill them all, Henry," the ghost voice from the moon said, and Henry could dig it. Henry felt he could second that emotion. He would kill them all, his tormentors, and then those feelings that he was losing his grip and that he was coming extraordinary to a larger world he would not be able to domain as he had dominated the play yard at Derry Elementary, that in the wider world the fat boy and the nigger and the stuttering freak might somehow grow larger while he somehow only grew older, would be done. He would kill them all, and the voices, those inside, and the one which spoke to him from the moon, would leave him alone. He would kill them and then go back to the house and sit on the back porch with his father's souvenir Jap sword across his lap. He would drink one of his father's Rigelins. He would listen to the radio too, but no baseball. Baseball was strictly Squaresville. He would listen to rock and roll instead, although Henry didn't know it and wouldn't have cared if he did. On this one subject, he and the losers agreed rock and roll and pretty much okie dokie. We got chicken in the barn. Whose barn? What barn, my barn. Everything would be good then. Everything would be the gingiest then. Everything would be okay, fine then. And anything which might come back would not matter. The voice would take care of him. He sensed that if you took care of it, it would care of you. That was how things had always been in Derry. But the kids had to be stopped. Stopped soon. Stopped today. The voice had told him so. Henry took his new knife out of his pocket, looked at it, turned it this way and that, admiring the way the sun winked and slid off the chrome facing. Then Belch was grabbing his arm and hissing, "Look at that, Henry, Jezelin, old crow. Look at that." Henry looked and felt the clear light of understanding and burst over him. A square section of the clearing was rising as if by magic, revealing a growing slice of darkness beneath. For just a moment he felt a jolt of terror, as if it occurred to him that this might be the owner of the voice, for surely it lived somewhere under the city. That he heard the grit and squall of dirt in the hinges and understood they hadn't been able to see the treehouse because there was none. By God, we was standing right on top of him, Victor grunted, and as it Ben's head and shoulders appeared in the square hatchway in the center of the clearing, he made as if to charge forward. Henry grabbed him and held him back. "Ain't we gotta get him, Henry?" Victor asked as Ben boosted himself. "We'll get him," Henry said, never taking his eyes from the hated fat boy. "Another ball kicker. I'll kick your balls so high up you can wear them for earrings, you fat fuck. Wait and see if I don't. Don't worry." The fat boy was helping the bitch out of the hole. She looked around doubtfully, and for a moment Henry believed she looked right at him. Then her eyes passed on. The two of them murmured together, and then they pushed their way into the thick undergrowth and were gone. "Come on," Henry said, when the sound of snapping branches and rustling leaves had faded almost too inaudibly. "We'll follow him, but keep back and keep quiet." I want 'em all together. The three of them crossed the clearing like shoulders on patrol, bent low, their eyes wide and moving. Belch paused to look down into the clubhouse and shook his head in a merry wonder, sitting right over their heads. "I was," he said. Henry motioned him forward impatiently. They took the path because it was quieter. They were halfway back to Kansas Street when the bitch and the fat boy holding hands. "Isn't that cute?" Henry thought in a kind of ecstasy, emerged almost directly in front of him. Luckily, their backs were to Henry's group, and neither of them looked around. Henry, Victor, and Belch froze, then drew into the shadows at the side of the path. Soon Ben and Beverly were just two shirts seamed through a tangle of scrubs and bushes. The three of them began to persons again. Casually, Henry took the knife out again, and 9. Henry gets a lift. 2:30 a.m. Press the chrome button in the handle. The blade popped out. He looked at it dreamily in the moonlight. He liked the way the starlight ran along the blade. He had no idea exactly what time it was. He was drifting in and out of reality now. A sound impinged on his unconsciousness and began to grow. It was a car engine. It drew closer. Henry's eyes widened in the dark. He held the knife more tightly, waited for the car to pass by. It didn't. It drew up at the curb beyond the cemetery hedge and simply stopped there, engine idly grimacing. His belly was stifling an engine now. It had gone bored hard, and the blood seeing suddenly between his fingers had the consterncy of sap just before you took the tabs out of the maples in late March or early April. He got on his knees and pushed aside the sniff hedge branches. He could see headlights in the shape of a car. Cops. His hands squeezed the knife and relaxed, squeezed and relaxed, squeezed and relaxed. "I sent you a ride, Henry," the voice whispered. "Sort of a taxi, if you can dig that. After all, we have to get you over there to the townhouse pretty soon. The night's getting old." The voice uttered one thin, bone-like chuckle and fell silent. Now the only sounds were the crickets and the steady rumble of the idling car. Sounds like cherry bombs mufflers, Henry thought distractedly. He got awkwardly to his feet and worked his way back to the seminary walk. He peeked around at the car, not a fuzz mobile, no bubbles on the roof, and the shape was all wrong. The shape was old. Henry heard that giggle again, or perhaps it was only the wind. He emerged from the shadow of the hedge, crawled under the chain, got to his feet again, and began to walk toward the idling car, which existed in a black and white Polaroid snapshot world of bright moonlight and impenetrable shadow. Henry was a mess. His shirt was black with blood, and it had soaked through his jeans, almost to the knees. His face was a white blotch under his indestructible crew cut. He reached the intersection of a seminary path and the sidewalk and peered at the car, trying to make sense out of the hulk behind the wheel. But it was the car he recognized first. It was the one his father always swore he would own someday, a 1958 Plymouth Fury. It was red and white, and Henry knew, hadn't his father told him often enough, that the engine's rumbling under the hood was a V8 327, available horsepower of 255, able to hit 70 from the get-go in just about 9 seconds, gobbling high test through its 4-barrel carb. I'm gonna get that car, and then when I die, they can bury me in it. Butch had been found of saying, except of course he had never gotten the car, and the state had buried him after Henry had been taken away, raving and screaming of monsters to the funny farm. If that's him inside, I don't think I can take it. Henry thought, squeezing down on the knife, swaying drunkenly back and forth, looking at the shape behind the wheel. Then the passenger door of the Fury swung open, the dome light came on, and the driver turned to look at him. It was Belch Huggins. His face was a hanging ruin. One of his own eyes was gone, and a rotted hole in one parched mint cheek and revealed blacked teeth. Perched on Belch's head was the New York Yankees baseball cap he had been wearing the day he died. It was turned around, backward. Gray-green mold oozed along the bill. Belch, Henry cried, and agony ripped its way up from its belly, making him cry out again, wordlessly. Belch's dead lips stretched in a grin, splinting open in a whitish-gray, bloodless folds. He held one twisted hand out toward the opening door in an invitation. Henry hesitated, then shuffled around the Fury's grill, allowing one hand to touch the V-shaped M-build there, just as he had touched it when his father took him into the Bangor showroom when he was a kid to look at his same car as he reached the passenger's side. Grayness overwhelmed in a soft wave, and he had to grab the open door to keep his feet. He stood there, head down, breathing in snuffling gases. At least the world came back part way anyhow, and he was able to work his way around the door and fell into the seat. Pain smouldered his guts again, and fresh blood squirted out into his hand. It felt like warm jelly. He put his head back and gritted his teeth, the cords on his neck standing out at last. The pain began to subside a little. The door swung shut by itself. The dome light went out. Henry saw one of Belch's rotten hands close over the transmission lever and dropped it into the drive. The butch white knots of Belch's knuckles glimmered through the decaying flesh of his fingers. The Fury began to move down Kansas Street toward Up Mile Hill. "How you doing, Belch?" Henry heard himself say. It was stupid, of course. Belch couldn't be here. Dead people couldn't drive cars, but it was all he could think of. Belch didn't reply. His own sunken eyes stared at the road. His teeth glared sickly at Henry through the hole in his cheek. Henry became vaguely aware that old Belch smelled pretty ripe. Old Belch smelled, in fact, like a bushel basket of tomatoes that had gone and watery. The glove compartment flopped open, banging Henry's knees. and in the light of the small bulb inside he saw a bottle of Texas Driver, half full. He took it out, opened it, and had himself a good shot. It went down like cool silk and hit his stomach like an explosion of lava. He started all over moaning and then began to feel a little better, a little more connected to the world. Thanks, he said. Belch's head turned toward him. Henry could hear the tendons in Belch's neck. The sound was like the scream of rusty screen doors' hinges. Belch regarded him for a moment with a dead one-eye stare, and Henry realized for the first time the most of Belch's nose was gone. It looked like something had been at the old Belch's nose. Dog. Maybe rats. Rats seemed more likely. The tunnels they had chased the little kids into that day had full of rats, moving just as slowly. Belch's head turned toward the road again. Henry was glad old Belch staring at him that way while Henry hadn't been able to dig it too much. There had been something in. There is a dead boy behind the wheel of his car. Henry looked down at his arm and saw that huge goosebumps had formed there. He quickly had another sort from the bottle. This one hit a little easier and spread its warm fodder. The Plymouth rolled down up Mile Hill and made its way around the counterclockwise traffic circle. Except at this time of night, there was no traffic. All the traffic lights had changed to yellow blinkers, splashing the empty streets and closed buildings with steady pulses of light. It was so quiet that Henry could hear the relays clicking inside each light. Or was that his imagination? Never went to leave you behind that day, Belcher, Henry said. I mean, if that was, on your mind. That screamed of dried tendons again. Belch looking at him again with his one sunken eye and his lips stretched in a terrible grin that revealed gray-black gums, which were growing their own garden of mold. What sort of a grin is that? Henry asked himself as the car peered silky up Main Street, past Freese's on the one side, Nan's Luncheon and the Aladdin Theater on the other. It is a forgiving grin, an old pal's grin, or is it the kind of grin that says, I'm going to get you, Henry. I'm going to get you for running out on me and Vic. What kind of grin? You have to understand how it was, Henry said, and then stopped. How had it been? It was all confused in his mind. The pieces jumbled up like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that had just been dumped out on one of the shitty card tables in the rec room at Jupiter Hill. How had it been? Exactly. They had followed the fat boy and the bitch back to Kansas Street and had waited back in the bushes watching them climb up the embankment to the top. If they had disappeared from view, he and Victor and Belch would have dropped the stocking game and simply gone after them. Two of them were better than none at all, and the rest would be along in time. But they hadn't disappeared. They had simply leaned against the fence, talking and watching the street. Every now and then would check down the slope into the barriers, but Henry kept his two troops well out of sight. The sky, Henry remembered, had become overcast, clouds moving in from the east, the air thickening. There would be the rain that afternoon. What had happened next? A bony levered hand closed over his forearm, and Henry screamed. He had been drifted away again into that cotton and grayness, but Belch's dreadful touch and the dagger of pain in his stomach from the scream brought him back. He looked around, and Belch's face was less than 2 inches from Henry's. He gasped and breathed, and which he hadn't the old Belchers really had gone to see. Henry was again reminded of tomatoes, going quietly, persuaded, in some shadowy shed corner. His stomach roiled. He remembered the end suddenly, the end for Belch and Vic anyway. How something had come out of the darkness as they stood in a shaft with a sewer. Grattan at the top of wondering which way to go next something. Henry hadn't been able to tell that until Victor shrieked, Frankenstein! It's Frankenstein! And so it was. It was the Frankenstein monster. with bolts coming out of its neck, and a deep snitch scarred across its forehead, lurching along in shoes like a child's block. Frankenstein, Vic had screamed. And then Vic's head was gone. Vic's head was flying across the shaftway to strike the stonework of the far side. With a sour, sticky thud, the monster's watery yellow eyes had fallen on Henry, and Henry had frozen. His bladder let go, and he felt warm flood down his legs. The creature lurched toward him and belched. Belch had listened. "I know I ran," Henry said. "I shouldn't have done that, but Belch only stared. "I got lost," Henry whispered, as if to tell the old Belcher that he had paid to. It sounded weak, like saying, "Yeah, I know you got killed, Belch, but I got one fuck of a splinter under my thumbnail, but it had been bad, really bad." He had wandered around in a world of stinking darkness for hours, and finally he remembered he had started to scream. At some point, he had fallen a long, dizzily fall, in which he had time to think, "Oh, good, in a minute, I'll be dead, I'll be out of this." And then he had been in fast-running water under the canal. He supposed he had come out into the fading sunlight. He had followed his way toward the bank and had finally climbed out of the Kansas, less than 50 yards from the place where Adrian Mellon would drown 26 years later. He slipped, fell, bashed his head, blacked out. When he woke up, it was after dark. He had somehow found his way out to Route 2 and had hooked a ride to the home place. And there the cops had been waiting for him. But that was then. This was now. Belch had stepped in front of Frankenstein's monster, and it had peeled the left side of his face down to the skull. So much Henry had been before fleeing, but now Belch was back, and Belch was pointing at something. Henry saw that they had pulled up in front of the Derry townhouse, and suddenly he understood perfectly. The townhouse was the only real hotel left in Derry. Back in 58, there had also been the Eastern Star at the end of Exchange Street and the Travelers' Rest on Trollope Street. Both had disappeared during unbanned renewal. Henry knew all about this. He had read the Derry News faithfully every day in Jupiter Hill. Only the townhouse was left, and a bunch of ticky-tacky little motels out by the interstate. "That's where they'll be, he thought, right in there. All of them that are left asleep in their beds with visions of sugar plums or sewers, maybe dancing in their heads. And I'll get them, one by one. I'll get them." He took the bottle of Texas Driver out again and bit off a snort. He could feel fresh blood trickle into his lap, and the seat was tacking beneath him. But the wine made it better. The wine seemed to make it not matter. He could have done with some good bourbon, but the driver was better than nothing. "Look," he said to Belch, "I'm sorry I ran. I don't know why I ran. Please don't be mad." Belch spoke for the first and only time, but the voice wasn't his voice. The voice that came from Belch's rotten mouth was deep and powerful, terrifying whisper. At the sound of it, it was the voice from the moon, the voice of the clown, the voice he had heard in his dreams of drains and sewers where water rushed on and on. "Just shut up and get them," the voice said. "Sure," Henry whined. "Sure, okay, I want no problem." He put the bottle back in the glove compartment. Its neck chattered briefly like teeth, and he saw a paper where the bottle had been. He took it out and unfolded, leaving bloody fingerprints on the corners. In boss across the top, what was this logo in bright scarlet? "A memo from Pennywise." Below this, carefully printed in capital letters: Bill Deprogue, 311. Ben Hanscom, 404. Eddie Kasprak, 609. Beverly Marsh, 518. Richie Tozier, 217. Their room numbers. That was good. That saved time. Thanks, but Belch was gone. The driver's seat was empty. There was only The New York Yankees baseball cap lay in there, mold-crusted on its bill, and some slimily stuffed on the top of the gear shift. Henry stared, his heart beating painfully in his throat, and then he seemed to hear something moved and shift in the back seat. He got out quickly, opening the door, and almost fallen into the pavement in the haste. He gave the Fury, which still burbled softly through its dual cherry bomb mufflers. Cherry bombs had been outlawed in the state of Maine in 1962. A wide berth. It was hard to walk. Each step pulled and toward at his belly, but they gained the sidewalk and stood there looking at the 8th floor brick building, which, along with the library and the Aladdin Theater and the cemetery, which was one of the few he remembered, he clearly from the old days. Most of the lights on the upper floors were out, but the frosted glass globes which flanked the main doorway blazed softly in the darkness, howled with mastery from the lingering ground fog. Henry made his laborious way toward and bent between them. Shorter and opened one of the doors. The lobby was wee hours silent. There was a faded Turkish rug on the floor. The ceiling was a huge mural exuded in rectangular panels, which showed scenes from Derry Logan days. There were overstuffed sofas and wing chairs and a great fireplace, which was now dead in silence. A bridge long thrown across the enormous, a real long log, no gas, a fireplace in the townhouse was not just a lobby, stage, a dressing, a plant spilled out of a low pots. The glass double doors leading to the bar and the restaurant were closed. From some inner office, Henry could hear the gabble of a TV turned low. He lurched across the lobby, his pants and shirt streaked with blood. Blood was grim into the folds of his hands. It ran down his cheeks and slashed his forehead like war paint. His eyes blooded from their sockets. Anyone in the lobby who had seen him would have run screaming in terror. But there was no one. The elevator doors opened as soon as he pushed the up button. He looked at the paper in his hand, then at the floor buttons. After a moment of deliberation, he paused and the doors closed. There was a faint hum of machinery as the elevator began to rise. Might as well start at the top and work my way down. He slumped against the rear wall of the car, eyes half closed. The hum of the elevator was smoothing like the hum of the machinery in the pumping stations, and of the drainage system that dry. It kept coming back to him. How everything seemed almost prearranged, as if all of them were just plain parts. How Victor the old Belcher had seemed, well, almost drugged. He remembered the car come to a stop, jolting him, and sending another wave of gripping into his stomach. The door slid open. Henry stepped out into the silent hallway. More plants, hanging one spider plants. He didn't want to touch any of them, not those oozing green runners. They reminded him too much of the things that had been hanging down there in the dark. He reckoned the paper Casbrack was in 609. Henry started down that way, running one hand along the wall for support and leaving a faint of bloody track in the wallpapers as he went. But he stepped away. Whenever he came close to one of the hanging spider plants, he wanted no truck with those. His breathing was harsh and dry. Here it was. Henry pulled the switchblade from his pocket, swashed his dry lips with his tongue, and knocked on the door. Nothing. He knocked again, louder this time. Was it sleeping good? He'd been in his jammies, only half awake, and when he opened the door, Henry would drive the switchblade directly into the hollow at the base of his neck, the veritable hollow just below the Adam's apple. Bellboy, sir, Henry said. Message from your wife. Did Kasprak have a wife? Maybe that had been stupid thing to say. He waited coldly alert. He heard footsteps, the shuffle of slippers. From Myra? He sounded alarmed. Good. He would be more alarmed in a few seconds. A pulse beat steadily, and Henry's tight temple. I guess so, sir. There's no name. It's just says, your wife. There was a pause, then a metallic rattle as Kasprak fumbled with the chain. Grin and Henry pushed the button on the switchblade handle. Clicked. He held the blade up by his cheek, ready. He heard the thumb bolt turn in just a moment. He would plunge the blade into his skinny little crepe throat. He waited, the door opened, and Eddie. 10. The losers all together. 1:20 p.m. Saw Stan and Richie just coming out of the Colosto Avenue market, each of them eating a rocket on a push-up stick. Hey, he shouted. Hey, wait up! They turned around and Stan waved. Eddie ran to join them as quickly as he could, which was not in truth very quickly. One arm was immersed in a plaster of Paris cast, and he had his parchments board under the other. What you say, Eddie? What you say, boy? Richie asked in his grandly rolling sovereign gentleman voice, the one that sounded more like Foghorn Leghorn in the Warner Bros. Cartoons than anything else. Ah, say, the boy's got a broken arm, ahem. Look at that, Stan. The boy's got a broken ahem. I say, be a good sport of a carry the boy's Parsonshee's bow wound for him. I can carry it, Eddie said, a little out of breath. How about lick on your rocket? Your mom wouldn't approve, Eddie, Richie said sadly. He began to eat faster. He had just gotten to the chocolate stuff in the middle. His favorite part, germs, boys. I say, you can get germs after eating after something else. I'll chance it, Eddie said. Reluctantly, Richie held his rocket up to Eddie's mouth and snatched it away quickly as soon as Eddie had gotten in a couple of moderately serious licks. You can have the rest of mine if you want, Stan said. I'm still full from lunch. Jews don't eat much, Richie instructed. It's part of their religion. The three of them were walking along complainingly enough, now heading up toward Camden Street in the Barriers. Derry seemed lost in a deep, hazy afternoon. Dozed the blinds of most of the houses they passed were pulled down. Toys stood abandoned on lawns as if their owners had been hastily called in from play or put down for naps. Thunder rumbled thickly in the west. Is it? Eddie asked Stan. No, Richie's just pulling your leg, Stan said. Jews eat as much as normal people. He pointed at Richie like him. You know you're pretty fucking mean to Stan, Eddie told Richie. How would you like somebody to say all that made-up shit about you just because you're a Catholic? Oh, Catholics do plenty, Richie said. My dad told me once that Hitler was a Catholic, and Hitler killed billions of Jews. Right, Stan? Yeah, I guess so, Stan said. He looked embarrassed. My mom was fierce when my dad told me that, Richie went on. A little remonstrance grin had surfaced on his face. Absolutely on. A little remonstrance grin had surfaced on his face. Absolutely furious. Us Catholics also had the inquisitions. That was the little dealie with the rack and the thumb screws and all that stuff. I figured all religions are pretty weird. Me too, said quietly. We're not Orthodox or anything like that. I mean, we eat ham and bacon. I hardly even know what being a Jew is. I was born in Derry, and sometimes we go up to Saginaw and Bangor for stuff like Yom Kippur, but he shrugged. Ham? Bacon? Eddie was mystified. He and his mom were meteorites. Orthodox Jews don't eat stuff like that, Stan said. It says some things in the Torah about not eating anything that creeps through it goes, but pigs are supposed to be out, also lobsters. But my folks eat them. I do too. That's weird, Eddie said, and burst out laughing. I never heard of a religion that told you what you could eat. Next thing, they'll be telling you what kind of gas you can buy. Kosher gas, Stan said, and laughed by himself. Neither Richie nor Eddie understood what he was laughing about. You gotta admit, Stanny, it is pretty weird, Richie said. I mean, not being able to eat a sausage just because you happen to be Jewish. Yeah, Stan said, you eat meat on Fridays. Geez, no, Richie said, shocked. You can't eat meat on Friday because... He began to grin a little. Oh, okay, I see what you mean. Do Catholics really go to hell if they eat meat on Fridays? Eddie asked, fantastically, totally unaware of that until 2 generations before his own people had been devout, polished Catholics who would no more have eaten meat on Friday than they would have gone outside with no clothes on. Well, I'll tell you what, Richie said. I don't really think God would send me down to the hot place just for getting and having a bologna sandwich for lunch on a Friday. But why take a chance, right? I guess not, Eddie said, but it seemed so stupid. He was going to say, and then he remembered a story Mrs. Polderless had told the Sunday school class when he was just a little kid. A first gardener and little worshippers. According to Mrs. Porcelain, a bad boy had once stolen one of the common bread. When the tray was passed and put it in his pocket, he took it home and threw it into the toilet bowl just to see what would happen at once, or so Mrs. Poltringham reported to her little worshippers. That water in the toilet bowl had turned a bright red. It was the blood of Christ, she said, and it had appeared to that little boy because he had done a very bad act called a blasphemy. It had appeared to warn him that by throwing the flesh of Jesus into the toilet, he had put his immortal soul in danger of hell. Up until then, Eddie had rather enjoyed the act of commission, which he had only been allowed to take the previous year. The Methodists used Welch's grape juice instead of wine, and the body of Christ was represented by cut-up cubes of fresh, springy Wonder Bread. He liked the idea of taking in food and drink as a religious rite, but following Mrs. Polderick's story, his awe of the ritual darkened into something more potent, something rather dreadful. Simply reaching for the cubes of bread became an act which required courage, and he always feared an electrical shock, or worse, that the bread would suddenly change color in his hand, become a blood clot, and despondent voice would begin to thunder in the church. Not worthy, damn to hell, often after he had taken permission, his throat would close up, his breath would begin to wheeze in and out, and he would wait with panic and patience for the benefits to be over so he could hurry into the vestibule and use his aspartame. You don't want to be so silly, he told himself as he grew older. That was nothing but a story, and Mrs. Poldlinch sure wasn't any saint. Mama said she was divorced down in Kitterin, and that she played bingo at St. Mary's in Bangor, and that real Christians don't gamble. Real Christians leave gambling for pagans and Catholics. All that made perfect sense, but it didn't believe his mind. The story of the common bread that turned the water in the toilet bowl to blood worried at him, groaned at him, even caused him to lose sleep. It came to him one night that the way to get his behind him once and for all would be to take a piece of the bread himself, toss it in the toilet, and see what happened. But such an experiment was far beyond his courage. His rational mind could not stand against the sinister image of the blood spread in its cloud of occasions and potential dominance in the water. It could not stand against the talismanic, magical increation. This is my body. Take, eat. This is my blood, shed for you and for many. No, he had never made the experiment. I guess all religions are weird, Eddie said now, but powerful. His mind added almost magical. Or what was blasphemous? He began to think about the thing they had seen on Neobolt Street, and for the first time he saw a crazy parle. A werewolf had, after all, come out of the toilet. Boy, I guess everybody's asleep, Richie said, tossing his empty rocket tube nonchalantly into the gutter. You ever seen it so quiet? What did everybody go to Bar Harbor for the day? Hey, you guys, Bill Deproke shouted from behind them. Wait up! Eddie turned delighted, as always, to hear Big Bill's voice. He was wheeling Silver around the corner of Costello Avenue, out-districting Mike, although Mike's Seamwidgen was almost brand new. Hey, yo, Silver, away! Bill yelled. He rolled up to them, doing perhaps 20 miles an hour, the playing cards close-spin, to the feather struts roaring. Then he backpedaled, locked the brakes, and pursued a murdering long skin mark. Stuttering Bill, Richie said. How are you, boy? I say, how do you do, boy? I'm okay, Bill said. Seen Ben or Beverly? Mike rode up and joined them. Sweat stood out of his face in little drops. How fast does that bike go, anyway? Bill laughed. I don't know exactly. Pretty fast. I haven't seen them, Richie said. They're probably down there, hanging out, singing two parts harmony. Boom, boom, ya da 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 da. You look like a dream, sweetheart. Stan Ernst made throwing up noises. He's just jealous, Richie said to Mike. Jews can't sing. Beep, beep, Richie said for him, and they all laughed. They started toward the barriers again. Mike and Bill pushing their bikes. Conversation was brisk at first, but then it lagged. Looking at Bill, Eddie saw an uneasy look on his face and thought that maybe the quiet was getting to him, too. He knew Richie had meant it was a joke, but it really did seem that everyone in Derry had gone to Bar Hambor for the day to somewhere. Not a car moved on the street. There was a single old lady pushing a carrier full of groceries back to her house or apartment. Sure is quiet, isn't it? Eddie ventured, but Bill only nodded. They crossed to the Barron's side of Kansick Street, and then they saw Ben and Beverly running toward them, shouting. Eddie was shocked by Beverly's appearance. She was usually so neat and clean, her hair always washed and tied back in a ponytail. Now she was streaked with what she looked like every kind of gluck in the universe. Her eyes were wide and wild. There was a scratch on one cheek. Her jeans were caked with crap, and her blouse was torn. Ben fell behind her, puffing his stomach, wobbling. Can't go down in the Barriers, Beverly was panting. The boys, Henry, Victor, they're down there somewhere with the knife. He has a knife. Slow down, Bill said, taking charge at once at the effortless, almost unconscious way of his. He glanced at Ben as he ran up, his cheeks flushed bright, his comprehensible chest heavy. She says Henry's gone crazy, Big Bill, Ben said. Shit, you mean he used to be the same? Richie asked and spat between his teeth. Shut up, Richie, Bill said, and then looked back at Beverly. Tell, he said. Eddie's hand crept into his pocket and touched his aspartame. He didn't know what all this was, but he already knew it wasn't good. Forcing herself to speak as calmly as possible, Beverly managed to get out an edited version of the story, a version that began with Henry, Victor, and Belch catching up to her on the street. She didn't tell them about her father. She was desperately ashamed of that. When she was finished, Bill stood silent for a moment, hands in his pocket, chin down, silver his handlebars, leaning against his chest. The others waited, throwing frequent glances at the railing that ran along the edge of the drop-off. Bill thought for a long time, and no one interrupted him. Eddie became aware, suddenly and effortless, that this might be the final act. That was how the day's silence felt, wasn't it? The feeling that the whole town had up and left, leaving the only deserted husks of buildings behind. Richie was thinking about the pictures in George's album that had suddenly come to life. Beverly was thinking about her father, how pale his eyes had been. Mike was thinking about the bird. Ben was thinking about the mummy and a smell like dead cinnamon. Stan Ernst was thinking of blue jeans, black and dripping, and hands as white as wrinkled paper, also dripping. Come on, Bill said at last. We're going down. Bill, Ben said. His face was troubled. Beverly said Henry was really crazy, that he meant to kill. It's not theirs, Bill said, gesturing at the green dagger-shaped slash of the barrens to their right, and below them, the underbush, the choked groves of trees, the bamboo, the glint of water. It's not their property. He looked around at them, his face grimmed. I'm tired of being scared by them. We beated them in the rock fight, and if we have to beat them again, we'll do it. But Bill, Eddie said, what if it's not just them? Bill turned to Eddie, and with real shock, Eddie saw how tired and drawn Bill's face was. There was something frightening about that face, but it wasn't until much, much later, as an adult drifting towards sleep after the meeting at the library, that he understood what that frightening thing was. It was the face of a boy driving close to the brink of madness. A boy who was perhaps unlimited, no more sane or in control of his own decisions than Henry was. Yet the dimensional Bill was still there, looking out of those haunted sacrifice eyes, an angry, determined Bill. Well, he said, what if it's not? No one answered him. Thunder boomed closer now. Eddie looked at the sky and saw the storm clouds moving in from the west and black thunder heads. It was going to rain a bitch, as his mother sometimes said. Now I'll tell you what, Bill said, looking at them. None of you have to go with me if you don't want to. That's up to you. I'll go along, Big Bill, Richie said quietly. Me too, Ben said. Sure, Mike said with a shrug. Beverly and Stan agreed, and Eddie laughed. I don't think so, Eddie, Richie said. Your arm's not, looking too cool. Eddie looked at Bill. I want him, Bill said. You walk with me, Eddie. I'll keep an eye on you. Thanks, Bill, Eddie said. Bill's tried, half-crazy face seemed suddenly loving to him. Loving and well-loved. He felt a dim sense of amazement. I'll die for him, I guess, if he told me to. What kind of power is that, if it makes you look like Bill looks now? It's maybe not such a good power to have. Yeah, Bill's got the ultimate weapon, Richie said. B.O. bombs. He raised his left arm and fluttered his right hand under the exposed armpit. Ben and Mike laughed a little, and Eddie smiled. Thunder boomed again, closing loud, enough this time to make them jump in a huddle closer together. The wind was picking up, rattling trash around in the gutter. The first of the dark clouds sailed over the hazy winged disk of the sun, and their shadow melted away. The wind was cold, chilling the sweat on Eddie's uncovered arm. He shivered. Bill looked at Stan and said a particular thing. Then, you got your bird book, Stan? Stan taped his hip pocket. Bill looked at them again. Let's go down, he said. They went down the embankment single file, except for Bill, who stayed with Eddie as he had promised. He allowed Richie to push Silver down, and when they had reached the bottom, Bill put his bike in the accustomed place under the bridge. Then they stood together, looking around. The coming storm did not produce a darkness, not even particularly a dimness, but the quality of the light had changed. The things stood out in a kind of dreamlike, steely relief, shadowless, clear, crinolist. Eddie felt a sinking of horror and impressionment in his guts as he realized why the quality of this light seemed so familiar. It was the same sort of light he remembered from the house at 29 Neobold Street. A streak of lightning tattooed the clouds, bright enough to make him wince. He put a hand up to his face and found himself counting 1, 2, 3, and then the thunder came in the single coffin bark, an explosive sound, a sound like an M80 firecracker, and then they drew even closer together. Wasn't any rain forecast this morning, Ben said uneasily. The paper said hot and hazy. Mike was screaming. The sky, the clouds. There were black-bottomed Neil boats, high and heavy, swiftly overrunning the blue haze that had covered the sky from horizon to horizon. When he and Bill came out of the Deprogue house after lunch, "It's coming fast," he said. Never saw a storm come to fast. And as if in confirmation, thunder whacked again. Come on, Bill said. Let's put Eddie's parchments and board in the clubhouse. They started along the path they had beaten in the weeks since the incident of the dam. Bill and Eddie were at the head of the line, their shoulders brushing the broad green leaves of the shrubs, the others behind them. The wind gusted again, making the leaves on the trees and bushes whisper together. Farther ahead, the bamboo rattled eerily like drums in a jungle tale. Bill, Eddie said in a low voice. What? I thought this was just in the movies, but Eddie laughed a little. I feel like somebody's watching me. Oh, they're all right, Bill said. Eddie looked around nervously and held his posturing board a little tighter. 11. Eddie's room, 3:05 a.m. He opened the door on a monster from a horror comic. A gore-streaked apparition stood there, and it could only be Henry Bowers. Henry looked like a corpse which has returned from the grave. Henry's face was frozen with doctor's mask of hate and murder. His right hand was cocked at cheek, level and even as Eddie's eyes widened, and he began to draw in his first shocked breath. The hand pistoned forward, the switchblade glittering like slink. With no thought, there was no time. If he had stopped to think, he would have died. Eddie slammed the door closed. It struck Henry's forearm, deflecting the knife's course so that it swung in a savage side-to-side arch less than an inch from Eddie's neck. There was a church as the door pinched Henry's arm against the jamb. Henry uttered a muffled cry. His hand opened, the knife clattered to the floor. Eddie kicked it and skirted under the TV. Henry threw his weight against the door. He outweighed Eddie by over 100 pounds, and Eddie was driving back like a dollar. His knees struck the bed, and he fell on it. Henry came into the room and swept the door shut behind him. He twisted the thumb bolt as Eddie sat up, wide-eyed, his throat already starting to whistle. "Okay, fag," Henry said. His eyes dropped momentarily to the floor, hunting for the knife. He didn't see it. Eddie groped on the night table and found one of the 2 bottles of Perrier water he had ordered earlier that day. This was the full one. He had drunk the other before going to the library because his nerves were shot, and he had a bad case of acid burn. Perrier was very good for the destruction. As Harry dismissed the knife and started toward him, Eddie gripped the green pear-shaped bottle by the neck and smashed it on the edge of the night table. Perrier foamed and fuzzed, crossed it, flooding out most of the pill bottles that stood there. Henry's shirt and pants were heavy with blood, both fresh and semi-dried. His right hand now hung at a strange angle. "Baby fag," Henry said. "Teach you to throw rocks?" He made it to the bed and reached for Eddie, who still hardly realized what was happening. No more than 40 seconds had eclipsed since he had opened the door. Henry grabbed for him. Eddie thrust the rag base of the Perrier bottle at him. He ripped it into Henry's face, pulling open his right cheek in a twisted flap and puncturing Henry's right eye. Henry uttered a breathless scream and staggered backward. His slit eye, leaking whitish yellow fluid, hung loosely from its socket. His cheeks sprayed blood. In a gaudy fountain, Eddie's own cry was louder. He got off the bed and went toward Henry to help him. Perhaps he wasn't really sure, and Henry lurched at him again. Eddie thrust with the Perrier bottle as if with a fencing sword, and this time the jagged points of green glass punched deep into Henry's left hand and sawed at his fingers. Fresh blood flowed. Henry made a thick, grunting noise, the sound almost of a man clearing his throat, and shoved Eddie with his right hand. Eddie flew back and struck the righted desk, his left arm twisted behind him somehow, and he fell on it heavily. The pain was a stunning, sickened flare. He felt the bone go along the fault line of that old break, and he had to clench his teeth against a scream of agony. A shadow blotted out of the light. Henry Bowers was standing over him, swaying back and forth. His knees buckled. His left hand was dripping blood on the front of Eddie's robe. Eddie had held onto the stump of the Perrier bottle, and now, as Henry's knees came completely unhinged, he got it from a front of him, jagged base pointing upward. The cap braced against his stramen. Henry came down like a tree, impaling himself on the bottle. Eddie felt it shatter in his hand, and a fresh bolt of grinding agony stuttered through his left arm, which was still trapped under his body. Fresh warmth cascaded over him. He wasn't sure if this batch was Henry's blood or his. Henry's twitched like a landed trout. His shoes rattled and almost improvised beat on the carpet. Eddie could smell his rotten breath. Then Henry sniffed it and rolled over. The bottle protruded groansomely from his midsection, capped end pointing toward the ceiling, as if it had grown there. "Gug," Henry said, and said no more. He looked up at the ceiling. Eddie thought he might be dead. Eddie thought of the waves of faintness that wanted to cover him over and dragged him down. He got to his knees and finally to his feet. There was fresh pain at his broken arm swung out in front of him, and that cleared his head a little, wheezing, fighting for breath. He made it to the night table. He picked his aspartame out of a puddle of carboned water, stuck it in his mouth, and triggered it off. He stuttered at the taste, then gave himself another blast. He looked around at the body on the carpet. Could that be Henry? Could it possibly be? It was grown old, his crew cut more gray than black, his body now fat and white and slug-like. It was still Henry, and Henry was dead. At long last, Henry was. "Gug," Henry said, and sat up. His hands clawed at the air as if for holds which only Henry could see. His gouged eyes leaked and dribbled, its bottom arch now bludged pregnantly down onto his cheek. He looked around, saw Eddie shrinking back against the wall, and tried to get up. He opened his mouth and a stream of blood gushed out. Henry collapsed again, heart racing. Eddie fumbled for the telephone and succeeded, only dialed 0. The phone rang again and again and again. Come on, Eddie fought. What are you doing down there, jacking off? Come on, please answer the frickin' phone. It rang again and again. Eddie kept his eyes on Henry, expecting him to start trying again his feet. Again at any moment. Blood, dear God, so much blood. Just a fuzzy, restful voice said at last. Ring Mr. Deprog's room, Eddie said. Quick as you can. With his utter ear, he was now listening to the rooms around him. How loud had they been? Was someone going to pound on the door and ask if everything was all right in there? You sure you want me to ring? The clerk asked. It's 10 after there. Free. Yes, do it, Eddie nearly screamed. The hand holding the phone was trembling convulsive. Little bursts. There was a nest of waspy, rotten, ugly singing. In his other arms had Henry moved again. No, surely not. Okay, the clerk said. Cool your jets, my friend. There was a click, and then the hoarse burn of a room phone ringing. Come on, Bill, come on. A sudden thought, gruesomely possible, occurred to him. Suppose Henry had visited Bill's room first, or Richie's, Ben's, Bev's, or had Henry perhaps paid a visit to the library. Surely he had been somewhere else first. If someone hadn't softened Henry up, it would have been Eddie, lying dead on the floor, with a switchblade growing out of his chest, the way the next of the Perrier bottle was growing out of Henry's gut. Or suppose Henry had visited all the others, catching them barely and half asleep, as Henry had caught him. Suppose they were all dead. And that thought there was so awful, Eddie believed he would soon begin screaming if someone didn't answer the phone in Bill's room. Please, Big Bill, Eddie whispered. Please be there, man. The phone was picked up, and Bill's voice, uncharacteristically cautious, said, Hello? Bill, Eddie said, almost babbled. Bill, thank God. Eddie, Bill's voice grew momentarily fainter, speaking to someone else, telling the someone who it was. Then it was back strong. What's the matter, Eddie? It's Henry Bowers, Eddie said. He looked at the body on the floor again. Had it changed positions? This time it was not so easy to persuade himself. It hadn't. Bill, he came here, and I killed him. He had a knife, I think. He lowered his voice. I think it was the same knife he had that day when he went into the sewers. Do you remember? I remember, Bill said grimly. Eddie, listen to me. I want you to... 12. The Barriers. 1:55 p.m. Go back and tell Ben to come up here. Okay, Eddie said, and dropped back at once. They were approaching the clearing now. Thunder rumbled in an overcast sky, and the bushes sighed in the rising breeze. Ben joined them as they came into the clearing. The trap door to the clubhouse stood open in a portable square of blackness in the green. The sound of the river was very clear, and Bill was suddenly struck by a crazy certainty that he was expecting that sound in this place for the last time in his childhood. He drew a deep breath, smelling earth and air, and the distant snooties dump, funning like a sullen volcano that cannot quite make up its mind to erupt. He saw a flock of birds fly off the railroad, trestling toward the old cape. He looked up at the boiling clouds. What is it? Ben asked. Why haven't they tried to get us? Bill asked. They are there, Eddie was right about that. I can feel them. Yes, Ben said. I guess they might be stupid enough to think we're going back into the clubhouse. Then they have us trapped. Maybe, Bill said, and he felt a sudden helpless fury at his stutter, which made it impossible for him to talk fast. Perhaps they were things he would have found impossible to say anyway. How he felt. He could almost see through Henry Bowers' eyes. How he felt that, although on opposite sides, pawns controlled by opposing forces, he and Henry had grown very close. Henry expected them to stand and fight It expected them to stand and fight and be killed. A chilling explosion of white light seemed to fill his heart. They would be victims of the killers that had been stalking Derry ever since George's death. All 7 of them. Perhaps their bodies would be found. Perhaps not. It all depended on whatever or not it could or would protect Henry. And to a lesser degree, Belch and Victor, yes, to the outside, to the rest of his town, will have been victims of the killer. And that's right in the funny sort of way that really isn't right. It wants us dead. Henry's the tool to get it done, so it doesn't have to come out. Me first, I think Beverly and Richie might be able to hold the others or Mike, but Stan's scared. And so Ben's, although I think he's strong, Stan said, and Eddie's got a broken arm. Why did I lead them down here? Christ, why did I? Bill, Ben said anxiously. The others joined them beside the clubhouse. Thunder whacked again, and the bushes began to rustle more urgently. The bamboo rattled on in the fading stormy light. Bill, it was Richie now. Shh. The others fell uneasily silent under his blazing, haunted eyes. He stared at the underbush, at the path twisting away through it, and back toward Kansan Street, and felt his mind suddenly go up another notch, as if to a higher place. There was no stuttering in his mind. He felt as if his thoughts had been borne in a way, on a mad flow of invitation, as if everything were coming to him. George at one end, me and my friends at the others. And then it will stop again, yes, again, because this has happened before, and there always has to some sacrifice at the end, some terrible thing to stop it. I don't know how. I can know that, but I do. And they let it happen, Bill muttered, staring wide-eyed at the ratty pigtail of Pat. Sure they do. Bill, Bev asked. Pleading Stan stood on one side of her, small and neat in a blue polo shirt and chinos. Mike stood on the other, looking at Bill intensely, as if reading his thoughts. They let it happen. They always do. And things quiet down. Things go on. It sleeps or hibernates like a bear, and then it starts again. And they know, people know. They know it has to be so it can be. Oh, please, God. Oh, please, God. He thrust his fist against his fist. Please, God, against the post. Let me get out the posts and still insist. Oh, God, oh, Christ. Oh, God. Oh, please. Let me be able to talk. I led you down here because no place is safe, Bill said, spittle blabbered from his lips. He wimped them with the back of one hand. Derry is it. Do you understand me? He glared at them. They drew away a little, their eyes shining, almost fanatical with fright. Derry is it. Placed. We go when it gets us. They won't see. They won't hear. They won't know. He looked at them, pleading. Don't you see how it is? All we can do is to try and finish what we started. Beverly saw Mr. Ross getting up, looking at her, folding his paper, and simply going into his house. They won't see. They won't hear. They won't know. And my father, take those pants off, slut child, had meant to kill her. Mike thought of lunch with Bill. Bill's mother had been off in her own dreamy world, screaming not to see either of them, reading a Henry James novel while the boys made sandwiches and gobbled them, standing at the counter. Richie thought of Stan's neat but utterly empty house. Stan had been a little surprised. His mother was almost always home at lunchtime. On the few occasions when she wasn't, she left a note saying where she could be reached, but there had been no note today. The car was gone, and that was all. Probably went shopping with her friend's Debbie, Stan said, frowning a little, and had set to work making egg salad sandwiches, which he had forgotten about it until now. Eddie thought of his mother when he had gone out with his parchment board. There had been none of his usual cautions. Be careful, Eddie. Get under cover if it rains. Eddie, don't you dare play any rough games, Eddie. She hadn't asked if he had his aspartame, hadn't told him what time to be home, hadn't warned him against those rough boys you play with. She had simply gone on watching her soap opera story on TV, as if he didn't existed, as if he didn't exist. A version of the same thought went through all the boys' minds. They had, at some point between getting up this morning at lunchtime, simply become ghosts. Ghosts, Bill said harshly. If we cut across through the old cape, Bill shook his head. I don't think so. We get caught in the bamboo, the quick mud, or there be real piranha fish in the Kanzuk, or something else. Each had his or her own different versions of the same end. Ben saw bushes, which suddenly became man-eating plants. Beverly saw flying leeches like the ones that had come out of the old refrigerator. Stan saw the mucky ground and the bamboo vomiting up the living corpses of children caught in there by the flayable quick mud. Mike Hanlon imagined saw small Jurassic reptiles with horse-sweet tooth suddenly boring out of the shaft of a rotten tree, attacking them, biting them to pieces. But he saw the crawling eye oozing down on top of them as they ran under the railroad trestle, and Eddie saw them climbing the old Cape embankment, only to look up and see the leper standing at the top, his sagging flesh crawled with beetle and maggots waiting for them. If we could get out of town somehow, Richie muttered, then winced as thunder, shouting a fierce negative from the sky. More rain fell. It was still only squilling, but soon it would begin to come down seriously in sheets and torrents. The day's hazy peace was now utterly gone, as if it had never been at all. We've been safe if we could just get out of this fucking town. Beverly began. Beep, beep, and then a rock came flying out of the shaggy bushes and struck Mike on the side of the head. He staggered backwards, blood flowing through the tight cap of his hair, and would have fallen if Bill hadn't caught him. Teach you to throw rocks, Henry's voice floated mockingly to them. Bill could see the others looking around, wide-eyed, ready to bolt in 6 different directions. And if they did not, it really would be over. Ben, he said sharply. Ben looked at him. Bill, we gotta run. 2 more rocks flew out of the bushes. One struck Stan on the upper thigh. He yelled, more surprised than hurt. Beverly sidestepped the second. It struck the ground and rolled through the clubhouse trap door. Do you remember the first day you came down here? Bill shouted over the thunder. The day the school I let out. Bill, Richie shouted. Bill thrust a shushing hand at him. His eyes remained fixed on Ben, pinning him to the spot. Sure, Ben said miserably, trying to look in all directions at once. The bushes were now wavering and dancing wildly, their motion nearly tidal. The drain, Bill said. The puppet station, that's where we're supposed to go. Take us there. A rodent cave beneath it. That was where he had hidden that first day. But to take us there, a fluid of rocks whizzed out of the bushes, and for a moment, Bill saw Victor Chris's face, somehow frightened, drugged, and avenged, all at the same time. Then a rock smashed into his cheekbone, and it was Mike's run to keep Bill from falling down for a moment. He couldn't see straight. His cheek felt numb. The sensation returned in painful throbs, and he felt blood running down his face. He swept at his cheek, wincing at the painful knob that was rising there, looked at the blood, wiped it on his jeans. His hair whipped wildly in the refreshing wind. Teach you to throw rocks, you stuttering asshole, Henry half laughed, half screamed. Take this, Bill yelled. He understood now why he had sent Eddie back to get Ben. It was that puppet station they were supposed to go to. That very one, and only Ben knew exactly which one. It was they ran along both banks of the Kanzuk at irregular intervals. It's the place, the way in, the way to it. Bill, you can't know that, Beverly cried. He shouted fiercely at her. At all of them, I know. Ben stood there for a moment, wetting his lips, looking at Bill. Then he struck off across the clearing, heading toward the river. A brilliant bolt of lightning streaked across the sky, purplish white followed by a rip of thunder that made Bill reel on his feet. A fist-sized chunk of rock sailed past his nose and struck Ben's buttocks. He yipped with pain, and his hand went to the spot. Yeah, fat boy, Henry cried, and at the same half-laughing, half-screaming voice the bushes rustled and crashed, and Henry's appeared as the rain stopped fooling around and came in the downpout. Water ran in Henry's crew cut, and his eyebrows drowned his cheeks. His grin showed all his teeth. Teeth you to throw. Mike had found one of the pieces of scrap wood left over from building the clubhouse roof, and now he threw it. He flipped over twice and struck Henry's forehead. He screamed, clapped one hand to the spot like a man who's just had one hell of a good idea, and sat down hard. Run, Bill Howard, after Ben. More crashes and stumbles in the bushes, and as the rest of the losers ran after Ben Hanscom, Victor and Belch appeared. Henry stood up, and the three of them gave chase. Even later, when the rest of that day had come back to Ben, he recalled only jumbled images of their run through the bushes. He remembered branches overloaded with dripping leaves slapping against his fist, jousting him with cold water. He remembered that the thunder and lightning seemed to have become almost constant. He remembered that Henry's screams for them to come back and fights seemed to emerge with the sound of the Kedzuk as they drew closer to it. Every time he slowed, Bill would whack him on the back to make him hurry up. What if I can't find it? What if I can't find that particular pumping station? The breath tore in and out of his lungs. Hot bloody tasted in the back of his throat. Its stitch was sinking into his slide. His buttocks sang where the rock had hit him. Beverly had said Henry and his friends meant to kill them. And Ben believed it now. Yes, he did. He came to the Kedzuk bank so suddenly that he nearly plunged over the hedge. He managed to get his balance, and then embankment undercut, but the spring runoff collapsed and he went trembling over anyway, skidding all the way to the edge of the fast-running water, his shirt rucking up in the back, claying, mud streaking and sticking to his skin. Bill pilled into him and yanked him to his feet. The others burst out of the bushes, which overhung the bank one after the other. Richie and Eddie were last. Richie with one arm slung around Eddie's waist, his dripping specs clinging pertinently to the end of his nose. Where? Bill shouted. Ben looked first left and then right, aware that the time was suicidally short. The river seemed higher already, and the rain-dark sky had given it a dangerous slate gray color as it boiled its way along. Its banks were choked with underbrush and stunted trees, all of them now dancing to the wind's tone. He could hear Eddie sobbing her breath. Where? I don't know, he began, and then he saw the leaning tree and the eroding cave beneath it. That was where he had hidden that first day. He had dozed off, and then when he woke up, he had heard Bill and Eddie goofing around. Then the big boys had come see Conquered. Ta-ta, boys. It was a real baby dam, believe me. There, he shouted, that way. Lightning and flash again, and this time Ben could hear it. A buzzing noise like an overload Lionel train transformer. It struck the tree and blew white electric fire, sizzled its garlandly base into splinters and toothpicks sized for a fairy tale giant. It fell toward the river with a rending crash, driving spray high into the air. Ben drew in a dismayed gasp. It smelled something hot and punky and wild. A fireball rolled up the bowl of the downed tree, seemed to flash brighter, and went on, thundered, exploded, not above them, but around them, as if they stood in the center of the thunderclap. The rain sheeted down. Bill thumped him on the back, awakening him from his dazed compilation of these things. Go! Ben went, splashing and stumbling along the verge of the river, his hair hanging in his eyes. He reached the tree. The little root cave beneath it had been obliterated, and climbed over it, digging his toes into its wet hide, scraping his hands and forearms. Bill and Richie manhandled Eddie over, and as he stumbled off the tree trunk, Ben caught him. They both went tumbling to the ground. Eddie cried out, "You all right?" Ben shouted, "I guess so," Eddie shouted back, getting to his feet. He fumbled for his aspirin and almost dropped it. Ben grabbed it for him, and Eddie gave him a grateful look as he stuffed it into his mouth and triggered it. Richie came over, then Stan and Mike. Bill boosted Beverly up onto the tree, and Ben and Richie caught her coming down on the far side, her hair plastered to her head, her blue jean now blacked. Bill came last, pulling himself onto the trunk and swinging his legs around. He saw Henry and the others two splashing down the river toward them, and as he slid off the fallen tree, he shouted, "Rocks! Throw rocks!" There were plenty of them here on the banks, and the lightning struck. Tree made a perfect barricade. In a moment or two, all 7 of them were chucking rocks at Henry and his pals. They had nearly reached the range, was point blank. They were driven back, yelling with pain and fury as rocks struck their faces, their chests, their arms, and legs. "Teach us to throw rocks," Richie shouted, and chucked one of the size of the hen's eggs at Victor and struck his shoulder and bounced almost straight up into the air. Victor howled, "Ah say. Go on and teach us, boys. We learn good." "Yeehaw," Mike screamed. How do you like it? How do you like it?" The answers was not much. They retreated until they were out of range and huddled together. A moment later, they climbed the bank, slipping and stumbling on the slick, wet earth, which was already honeycombed with little running semlets holding onto branches to stay upright. They disappeared into the underbrush. "They're gonna go around us," Big Bill, Richie said, pushing his glasses up on his nose. "That's okay," Bill said. "Go on, Ben. We'll follow you." Ben trotted along the embankment, paused, expecting that Henry and the others would burst out into his face at any moment, and saw the pumping station 20 yards farther down the Strempin. The others followed him to it. They could see other cylinders on the opposite banks, one fairly close, the other 40 yards upstreams. Those 2 were shooting torrents of muddy water into the Kanzak, but only a trickle was coming from the pipe sticking out of the embankment below this one. It wasn't humming either, Ben noticed. The pumping machinery had broken down. He looked at Bill thoughtfully and with some fright. Bill was looking at Richie, Stan, and Mike. "We get to lid off," he said. "Help me." There was handholds in the iron, but the rain had made them slippery, and the lid itself was incredibly heavy. Ben moved in next to Bill, and Bill shifted his hands a little to make room. Ben could hear water dripping inside, an echoing unpleasant sound like water's dripping into a well. "Now," Bill shouted, and the 5 of them heaved in unconscious. The lid moved with an ugly, grunting sound. Beverly grabbed on beside Richie and Eddie, pushed with his good arm. 1, 2, 3, pushed, Richie chanted. The lid granted a little farther off the top of the cylinder. Now a crescent of darkness showed. 1, 2, 3, push. The crescent faceted. 1, 2, 3, push. Ben shoved until red spots danced in front of his eyes. "Stand back," Mike shouted. There it goes. There it goes." They stood away and watched as the big circular cap overbalanced, then fell. It dug a slash in the wet earth and landed upside down like an oversized checker. Beetles skirted off its surface and into the matted grass. "Ugh," Eddie said. Bill peered inside iron rungs, descended into a circular pool of black water. Its surface now pocked with raindrops. The silent pump brooded in the middle of this half-submergent. He could see water flowing into the pumping station from the mouth of its inflow pipe and with a sinking in its guts. He thought, "That's where he have to go. In there. Eddie, grab onto me." Eddie looked at him uncomfortably, like a pigger back. "Hold on with your good arm," he demonstrated. Eddie understood, but was recollected. "Quick," Bill snapped. "They'll be here." Eddie grabbed on around Bill's neck. Stan and Mike boosted him up so he could hook his legs around Bill's midsection as Bill swung clumsily over the lip of the cylinder. Ben saw that Eddie's eyes were tightly shut over the rain. He could hear another sound. Whipping branches, snapping twigs, voices. Henry, Victor, and Belch, the world's ugliest Cravel in charge. Bill gripped the rough, concerned lip of the cylinder and felt his way down, step by careful step. The iron rungs were slippery. Eddie held him in what was almost a death grip, and Bill supposed he was getting a pretty graphic documentary of what Eddie's asthma was really all about. "I'm scared, Bill," Eddie whispered. I am too." He let go of the concerned rim and grabbed the topmost rug, although Eddie was nearly choking him and felt as if he had already gained 40 pounds. Bill paused a moment, looking at the Baryons, the Kanzik, the racing clouds. A voice inside, not a frightening voice, just a firm one, had told him to take a good look in case he never saw the upper world again. So he looked, then began to descend with Eddie clinging to his back. "I can't hold on much longer," Eddie managed. "You won't have to," Bill said. "We're almost down." Out of his feet went into chilly water. He felt for the next rung and found it. There was another below that, and then the ladder ended. He was standing in knee-deep water beside the pump. He squatted, wincing, as the cold water soaked his pants and let Eddie off. He drew a deep breath. The smell wasn't so hot, but it was great not to have Eddie's arm wrapped around his throat. He looked up at the cylinder's mouth. It was about 10 feet over his head. The others were grouped around the rim, looking down. "Come on," he shouted. One at a time. Be quick." Beverly came first, swinging easily over the rim and grabbing the ladder, and Stan next. The others followed. Richie came last and pausing to listen to the progress of Henry and his friends. He fought from the sound of their bluttering process that they would probably pass a little to the left of his pumping station, but almost certainly not by enough to make a difference. At that moment, Victor belched, "Henry, there, Tozier." Richie looked around and saw them rushing toward him. Victor was in the lead. And then Henry pushed him aside so savagely that Victor skidded to his knees. Henry had a knife. All right, a regular pig sticker. Drops of water were falling from the blade. Richie glanced into the cylinder, saw Ben and Stan helping Mike off the ladder, and swung over himself. Henry understood what he was doing and screamed at him. Richie laughed crazily. Stan slammed his left hand in the crook of his right elbow and struck his forearm skyward, his hand fisted in what may be the world's oldest gesture. To be sure, Henry got the point. He popped his middle finger up and down the ladder again, as quick. Oh, wait, hold on. Sorry. Fingered up. "You'll die there," Henry shouted. "Prove it," Richie shouted, laughing. He was terrified of going into this concerned throw, but he still couldn't stop laughing. In an Irish cop voice, he bludged. "Sure and begruin, the luck of the Irish never runs out. Me fawn, lad." Henry slipped on the wet grass and went sprawling out of his butt, less than 20 feet from where Richie stood, his feet on the top rung of the ladder, bolted to the inner curve of the pumping station, his head and chest out. "Hey, banana heels," Richie shouted, Larison with trumpeting, and then shouted down the ladder. The iron rugs were slicked, and once he almost fell. Then Bill and Mike grabbed him, and he was standing up to his knees in water with the rest of them in a loose circle around the pump. He was trembling all over. He felt hot and cold, chills chasing each other up his back, and still he couldn't stop laughing. "You should have seen him," Big Bill, clumsy as ever. "Still can't get it out of his own frogging way." Henry's head appeared in the circular open at the top. Scratchings from branches and brambles crisscrossed his cheeks. His mouth was working. His eyes blazed. Okay, he shouted down at them. His words had a flat resonator inside the conference cylinder, not quite an echo. Here I come. Got you now. He swung one leg over, felt for the topmost rung with his foot, found it, swung the other one over. Speaking loud, Bill said. When he gets down close enough, we all grab him, pull him down, dick him under. Got it? Righto, Governor, Richie said, and snapped a salute with one trembling hand. Got you, Bill said. Stan tipped a wink at Eddie, who didn't understand what was going on, except it seemed to him that Richie had gone crazy. He was laughing like a loon while Henry Bowers, the dreaded Henry Bowers, prepared to come down and kill them, all like rats in a rain barrel. All ready for him, Bill, Stan cried. Henry froze their free rugs down. He looked down at the losers over his shoulder. His face seemed for the first time doubtful. Eddie suddenly got it. If they came down, they would have to come one at a time. It was too high to jump, especially with the pumping machinery to land on. And here they were, the 7 of them, waiting in a tight little circle. Come on, Henry, Bill said pleasantly. What are you waiting? That's right, Richie chimed in. You like to beat up little kids, right? Come on, Henry. We're waiting, Henry, Bev said sweetly. I don't think you'll like it when you get down here. But come on if you want to. Unless you're a chicken, Ben added. He began to make chicken sounds. Richie joined him at once, and soon all of them were doing it. The deserved chuckling rebounded between the damp trickling walls. Henry looked down at them, the knife clutched in his left hand. His face in the color of old bricks. He put up with perhaps 30 seconds of it, and then climbed out again. The loser sent up cat calls and insults. Okay, Bill said. He spoke in a lower voice. We got into the drain quick. Why, Beverly asked, but Bill was spared the effort of an answer. Rock the size of a soccer ball into the pipe. Beverly screamed, and Stan pulled Eddie against the circular wall with a hoarse yell. The rock struck the pumping machinery's rusty housing and produced a musical bong. It ricochetted left and struck the concerned wall, missing Eddie by less than half a foot. A chip of concern flicked painfully against his cheek. The rock fell into the water with a splash. Quick, Bill shouted again, and they crowded around the pumping stations in flow pipe. It's borne about 5 feet in diameter. Bill sent him in one after another, a Vagu circus image, all the big clowns coming out of the little car, passed across his commissioners in a mimic flash. Years later, he would use the same image in a book called The Black Rapids, and climbed in last after ducking another rock. As they watched, more rocks flew down, more striking the pump house, and rebounded at crazy angles. When they stopped falling, Bill looked out and saw Henry coming down the ladder again as quick as he could. Get him, he shouted to the others. Richie, Ben, and Mike floundered out behind Bill. Richie leaped high and grabbed Henry's ankle. Henry cursed and shook his legs as if he trying to keep away. A small dog with big teeth, a terrier perhaps, or a Penzgek. Richie grabbed. A rung scrambled up even higher, and Actual did manage to sink its teeth into Henry's ankle. Henry screamed and pulled himself up. Quickly, one of his loafers came off and splashed into the waters, where it sank with no ado at all. Bit me, Henry was screaming. Bit me! Cocksucker bit me! Yeah, good thing I had a tennis shot this spring, Richie flung to him. Bashed them, Henry was raving. Bashed them! Bond them back to the Stone Age! Bashed your brains in! More rocks flew. The boys backed into the drain again. Quickly, Mike was struck on the arm by a small rock, and he held it tight, wincing until the pain began to abate. It's a standoff, Ben said. They can't get down, and we can't get up. We're not supposed to get up, Bill said quietly. Sorry. And you all know it. We're not ever supposed to get up again. They looked at him, their eyes hurt and afraid. No one said anything. Henry's voice, fury, macaron as a mockery, floated down. He can't wait here all day, you guys. Beverly had turned away and was looking back along the bore of an inflown pipe. The light grew diffuse quickly, and she could not see much. What she could see was a concerned tunnel, its lower third filled with rushing water. It was higher on her now than it had been when they first squeezed in here. She realized that would be because this pump wasn't working and only some of the water was exiting. On the Kansas side, she felt claustrophobia touch her throat, turning the skin. There was just something that felt like fennel. If the water rose enough, they would drown. Bill, do we have to? He shrugged. It said everything. Yeah, they had to. What else was there? Be killed by Henry, Victor, and Belton, the Barrions, or by something else? Maybe something worse in town? She understood his thought well enough. There was no stutter in his shrug. Better for them to get to it. Have it out like the showdown in a Western movie. Clearer, braver, Richie said. What was that ritual you told us about, Big Bill? The one in the library? Chud, Bill said, smiling a little. Chud, Richie nodded. You bite its tongue and it bites yours, right? Right. Then you tell jokes? Bill nodded. Funny, Richie said, looking into the dark pipe. I can't think of a single one. Me neither, Ben said, the fear of heavy in his chest, almost suffocating. He felt that the only thing keeping him from just sitting down in the water and blubbering like a baby or just going crazy was Bill's calm Sir Prentice and Beverly. He felt he would rather die than show Beverly how afraid he was. Do you know where the pipes goes? Stan asked Bill. Bill shook his head. Do you know how to find it? Bill shook his head again. We'll know when we're getting close, Richie said suddenly. He drew a deep, trembling breath. If we have to do it, then let's go. Bill nodded. I'll be first, and Eddie, Ben, Bev, Stan the man. Mike, you last. Richie, everyone keep one hand on the shoulder of the person in front of you. It's going to be dark. You coming out? Henry Bowers shrank down at them. We're gonna come out somewhere, Richie muttered. I guess. They formed up like a procession of a blind man. Bill looked back once, confirming that each had a hand on the shoulder of the person ahead, then bending towards slightly against the rush of the current. Bill Deprogue led his friends into the dark, where the boat he had made for his brother had gone almost a year before.